Hey guys, tonight we're getting messy, soft, curdled, slippery messy as we wade into the questionable dairy practices of the Middle Ages. Imagine a foggy pre-dawn morning in the countryside. You're standing in a muddy field, freezing, holding a wooden pail, and trying to convince a grumpy cow named Loon to let you near her udders without kicking you into next week. The air smells like damp hay, wet leather, and something sour you're trying not to identify. You don't have gloves. You barely have boots, and you've already stepped in something that squelched ominously. Welcome to medieval cheesemaking, where the only thing more uncertain than your milk yield is whether you'll survive until breakfast without stepping on a rake. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments. What's your location and local time as you're drifting off? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge out of the barn and toward the cowshed. Loon is waiting, chewing with the side eye of someone who remembers that time you tried to milk her from the wrong side. She lifts her hoof threateningly as you approach. Cows, in this era, aren't gentle giants. They're tools, temperamental ones. Most villagers own only one or two, if that, and they're walked communally to pasture, grazed together, and milked by whoever's available and unlucky that morning. You're that unlucky person today. The milking stool wobbles. You grip the wooden pail under her belly and begin, whispering soft apologies to the cow and to your aching hands. The milk is warm, at least, but you can already tell this batch won't be much. Not after last night's storm. The cow's stressed. Everyone's stressed. And you still have to do this for 3 more animals. The medieval dairy system wasn't built for abundance. It was built for necessity. Milk spoils fast, so most of it had to be transformed within hours into something else, something that might last a week, maybe even a month. If luck and the wind were on your side, you strain the milk through linen that hasn't seen soap in at least a month. You check the temperature by dipping in your elbow. Yes, elbow. Thermometers haven't been invented yet, and frankly, your elbow is better than nothing. Now comes the first gamble. Did you remember to pack enough rennet? You reach into the pouch hanging from your belt and pull out the dried scrap of calf stomach, yes, stomach lining, known as rennet, used to curdle the milk. If it's too old, nothing will happen. If it's too fresh, the curds will form too fast and turn rubbery. You chew your lip as you slice off a bit and swirl it into the milk. Then you wait. This is the most nerve-wracking part. You sit there in a warm fog of sour air, watching milk that may or may not become food. You've added no culture, no commercial bacteria. There is no measuring, no charts, only hope, and a little muttered superstition. Finally, after what feels like forever, the milk begins to separate. A pale yellow liquid whey rises to the top. The curds look decent, not perfect, but not awful. And most importantly, they don't smell like failure. You press them into a cloth-lined basket, tying the corners into a loose sack. Then you hang it on the hook above your door, letting gravity do its work. It'll drip for hours, maybe overnight, and you'll check it a dozen times, because if the rats find it first, it's over. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers made cheese with real consistency, or just crossed their fingers and hoped the results didn't kill them. Regional techniques varied wildly, and some sources suggest local herbs or roots were sometimes added to help coagulation or flavor, or maybe just because someone's aunt insisted it worked. You glance over at the cat. He's sniffing the bottom of the sack with interest. You shoo him away, knowing full well he'll be back the moment you turn around. Outside, the sun is finally rising. Your hands are raw. Your feet are damp. And you haven't even begun skimming the cream off yesterday's milk batch to churn butter. You don't envy modern chefs. You just envy their refrigeration. There's no real recipe here. No rules. Just survival and stubbornness. Some cheeses will be crumbly. Others slimy. A few will turn blue around the edges and, shockingly, become delicious. Others will be buried behind the barn, with no questions asked. You wipe your hands on your tunic and pour the leftover whey into a shallow trough for the pigs. Nothing is wasted, not even your pride. You'll try again tomorrow. Because here in the medieval countryside, making cheese isn't just cooking. It's rolling dice with milk. The church bells toll in the distance, 3 slow, echoing notes, and that means one thing. The curding has to begin. You haul the now drained sack of curds from its hook. arms straining against the heavy, pulpy weight. It's soft, springy, and faintly warm. If you press your ear close, you swear you can still hear it fizzing with microscopic protest. You carry it inside and place it near the hearth, where it can warm just a bit more, but not too much. Warmth is your friend until it suddenly isn't. The hearth flickers quietly. A pot of soup simmers for lunch, and someone's drying lavender bundles in the corner. But you're not focused on flowers or stew. You're focused on the curds and the process you're about to fumble through. This is where things get risky. You spread a cleanish cloth across the table and untie the curd sack. The texture's better than yesterday. It holds its shape, wobbling only slightly less like porridge, more like pudding. You reach for the knife and begin cutting the curd into cubes. Slowly, watching the whey ooze from the crevices like a ghost exiting its body. This step is oddly satisfying. The cubes glisten. They slide and separate, revealing their inner sheen. But here's the thing, your knife is too dull. You've meant to sharpen it since the last market day. You didn't. So now, each cut squishes more than slices. You grit your teeth and keep going. Back in the day, they didn't call this cheese making with any scientific pomp. It was just another part of the kitchen work done by mothers, nuns, shepherd boys, and occasionally very confused apprentices. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exact, and it certainly wasn't measured. You heat a fresh pot, pour in the sliced curds, and stir slowly with a wooden spoon that smells faintly of onions. Yes, it might lend a subtle note to the final cheese, or it might make it taste like stew. Historians still debate whether flavor was an intentional element of medieval cheese, or just an accidental consequence of whatever the curd happened to touch on its chaotic journey. The goal now is to dry it further, to stir and cook gently until the curds shrink and toughen. You stir like your life depends on it, because, well, sometimes it kind of did. One too many spoiled wheels could mean going hungry for a week. One suspicious smell, and the village priest might accuse you of witchery or worse, wasting good milk. So you stir, and you whisper a few prayers of your own, just in case the cheese gods are listening. Eventually, the curds firm up. You scoop them out and pack them into a wooden mold round, heavy, stained with years of dairy ghosts. You tamp it down with the palm of your hand, then cover it with cloth and a round press stone. You'll leave it like this for the night, maybe 2 nights. Depends on the air, the moon, your luck. The neighbor's mood. Cheesemaking in the Middle Ages didn't come with time charts. It came with gut instinct and superstition. You step back to admire your work. It's lumpy, but it smells promising like warm hay, sweet grass, and a hint of barn. That's a good sign. You hope. Suddenly, the door creaks open, and old Tom from 2 farms over sticks his head in. He sniffs. You making cheese again? You nod. He grunts, then adds, smells less like regret than last week's. Compliment? Maybe. He leaves. As the curd rests, you wipe down the table and light a beeswax candle. The day is already half gone, and you haven't even churned the butter, let alone skimmed the cream for tomorrow's batch. But still, you allow yourself a moment. The cheese is quiet now. Pressed. Waited. Becoming. You sit near the hearth and stretch your back. A cat curls around your feet, hoping for a drop of whey or a morsel of crumb. You toss him a crust, and for a moment, everything feels, if not perfect, then at least promising. Then the cheese mold creaks, and you remember you forgot to salt the curds. You jump to your feet. Rookie mistake. Salt isn't just flavor. It's defense. Without it, your cheese will spoil faster than gossip in a village market. You unwrap the cloth, pull back the press, and sprinkle in the coarse gray salt like you're blessing it against evil spirits. Some might say the spirits already noticed. But with luck and maybe a second round of pressing, you'll survive the day. And with even more luck, so will your cheese. You wake before the sun, and the first thing you think about, ridiculously, unromantically, is a calf's stomach, specifically the one drying by your chimney, stiff as old parchment, curled like a forgotten scroll. You trudge to the hearth in your woolen socks, barely awake, and check it. Still dry, still pungent, still the key to your dairy's survival. Because today, you're making rennet again. And yes, that means dealing with innards before breakfast. In the Middle Ages, cheesemaking was surprisingly dependent on a very specific bit of anatomy. The fourth stomach of a young, milk-fed calf. Inside it lives a magical little enzyme called chymosin. which makes milk curdle in that smooth, creamy way that's necessary for real cheese, not just sad milk jelly. You pull the dried stomach down from the chimney beam where it's been curing for a week. It's light and crispy, like overbaked parchment, and it smells assertive. Not horrible. Exactly. But definitely barn adjacent. You snip a piece off with shears, soak it in a small bowl of warm, salted water, and wait. This, once fully steeped, becomes your rennet solution, your curdling agent. And it's always a gamble. Too little, and your milk stays a weepy mess. Too much, and the curds tighten into cheese-flavored rubber bands. Historians still argue whether most rural cheesemakers actually understood the science of enzymes, or just noticed that milk does weird things around baby cow guts and ran with it. Likely the latter. Medieval cookbooks don't explain much, unless you count vague instructions like, do it as thou should, which isn't terribly helpful when you're elbow deep in dairy. You pour your fresh milk into the big clay pot. It's warm from this morning's milking, thanks, Loon, for not kicking the pail this time, and you gently stir in your rennet brew. And now, the waiting begins again. You sit, nursing a chipped cup of barley tea, watching the milk like it owes you rent. And just when you're about to give up there, the first signs of curdling. The surface stills, thickens, a soft jiggle when you nudge it. It's working. You slice the curds with a long-handled knife. They part cleanly, thankfully releasing whey with the color and clarity of faint gold. You scoop them gently into a sieve lined with rough linen, letting them drain like tired soldiers, each one still hot from the curdling process, faintly squeaky when pressed. This batch will be harder cheese. You decide aged a bit longer, maybe even dried on wooden shelves. You're feeling brave today, and if the rats don't get to it first, it might even last until next month's trading day. You pack the curds tightly into a shallow mold, no press this time. You'll flip it hourly, let it air naturally. The wind has turned dry. That'll help. Still, there's the question of what to wrap it in. Your options: cloth soaked in brine, clean waxed linen if you can find some, or if you're truly desperate, cabbage leaves. You choose brine cloth. It's less poetic, but more practical. Plus, the cabbage from last season went sour 2 months too soon. As you wrap the wheel, you remember a story Dahi once told, yes. Her again, the traveling cook from the Eastern Abbey. She said in some villages, people swore that the cheese would fail unless it was turned with prayers whispered under breath. Not holy ones. Cheese prayers. Low, muttering spells that said things like, may your mold be mild and your rind not rise. You chuckle. Then you whisper one, just to be safe, later. As you set the wrapped cheese onto a high shelf near the window, you pause. There's another wheel there already, yesterday's. You check it. It smells complicated, sharp, a bit like wool socks, but that's not necessarily bad. In fact, the best cheeses often smelled like they had opinions. You press your nose closer. There's a hint of ammonia. Not great. You press your thumb gently into the side. It springs back. Better. You cut a wedge with your smallest knife. Sniff again. And yes, blue veins. Not too much, just enough to suggest something's growing in there. Something intentional. You taste it. It's creamy, bold, and faintly metallic. Maybe that's the knife. Maybe it's mold. Either way, your stomach doesn't rebel immediately, which in this era qualifies as a culinary triumph. You wrap the rest and tuck it back onto the shelf. Some people in the village will refuse to eat this kind of cheese. Too funky. Too blue. Too alive. They'll say it smells like sin. They'll say monks made it by mistake. They'll say it crawled out of the devil's laundry basket. But you'll sell it to the traveling merchant who likes strange flavors and always brings you candied quince in return. Deal of the century. You've waited 3 days. 3 long days of flipping, checking, sniffing, tapping. Your cheese wheel sits on its shelf like a sleeping cat, quiet, warm, and suspiciously soft in some places. And now it's time to find out. Did it age gracefully? Or did it ferment itself into a microbial nightmare? You lift it from the shelf with both hands. It's heavier than before. Denser, and it squishes ever so slightly. Not the good kind of squish. Is this a living thing? Kind. Still, you bring it to the cutting board and draw your smallest, sharpest knife. It glints in the firelight, nicked at the edge. But eager, you take a breath and slice into the rind. The wheel of moldy fortune turns, and you lose. Blue-green veins streak through the creamy middle, Not the beautiful marbling of a well-aged Roquefort, but aggressive blotches blooming like damp lace. The rind peels back in chunks. The smell is a sharp, wet sourness that crawls up your nose and sets up camp behind your eyes. You wince. Not because you're squeamish, no. Medieval cheesemakers are made of tougher stuff, but because you remember this exact smell from last winter, when a batch spoiled and gave a neighbor mysterious stomach cramps. He claimed he saw visions. The priest blamed bad dreams. The rest of the village blamed your cheese. This time, you're careful. You cut a sliver from the cleanest edge. Hold it. Sniff it. The aroma has softened. Nutty, maybe a little peppery. You nibble. You wait. Nothing explodes. Your eyebrows remain intact. You exhale. Historians still argue whether this kind of moldy cheese was intentionally made or simply tolerated until someone decided it was interesting. Blue cheese as a deliberate art didn't emerge formally until later, but it's likely that happy accidents like yours happened more often than not. But medieval cheese was less about flavor profiles and more about edible probability. If it didn't kill you or insult your host, it passed the test. You trim the moldy edge and salvage a decent wedge. You'll dry it further, maybe smoke it, maybe bury it in ash for a few days, like the monks do. Yes, ash. In fact, you remember something about ash aging from Deki, who once described a monastery in the hills where wheels were crusted in layers of charcoal and left to age in stone niches. She swore the resulting flavor was smoky, dense, and like chewing on history. You're not sure if that was a compliment. You gather the ashes from yesterday's fire still warm, still clean, and pack them loosely around the remaining wedge. It feels like tucking in a reluctant child. Back on the shelf it goes. For now, you turn back to the wheel and consider its fate. Could it be used for anything else? Something non-edible? Perhaps you've heard of villagers using bad cheese as rodent repellent, or foot balm, or witch traps. There's even a tale, half-believed, of a cursed cheese wheel buried under the church bell tower to keep the devil from eavesdropping during Mass. No one wants to talk about that one. You wrap your unlucky wheel in muslin and quietly, discreetly, carry it outside to the back garden. Behind the nettles and under the elder tree is your unofficial cheese graveyard. 3 stones mark the others, batch 12 too soft, batch 15 vormi, and batch 18 so loud it drew flies from across the river. You place the new one beside them, say a brief word, and cover it with earth. Rest in peace. Wheel 19. May your mold grow elsewhere. You return to the kitchen with soot on your hands and a strangely light heart. After all, it wasn't a total loss. You still have that smoky wedge, a new batch draining on the hook, and a cat who has, for the first time in 3 days, chosen to sit near you again. You slice some bread, smear it with butter, and nibble thoughtfully. Cheese will always be a gamble, but then again, so is bread. So is butter. So is life in a village where the cows can give or take your future with a single kick. You lean back in your chair and smile. Maybe tomorrow's batch will be better. Maybe it won't. But you'll be there with your knife, your elbow thermometer, and a prayer for clean curds. Brine baths are supposed to help. In theory, salt preserves, salt protects. Salt says, mold. Not today. But as you stare down at the wooden vat of cloudy, tepid brine and the cheese wheel floating inside it like a bloated raft, you're not so sure. You reach in, turn the wheel gently with both hands, and notice something. It's getting softer, not firmer. You mutter a few choice words, not quite curses, but certainly cheese-related complaints, and pull the wheel out to inspect it. It drips steadily, the surface slightly spongy. You poke it, it jiggles back. It's supposed to be firmer than this by now. Then again, the brine wasn't made with clean water. The river's been high this week, and you might have scooped too close to where the ducks like to loiter, and you may have run low on coarse salt and topped it off with table salt ground too fine. And yes, you did leave the wheel soaking a bit longer than the just until it sings guideline. Still, you've seen worse. You pat the wheel dry, sprinkle more salt on top like a baker gone rogue, and wrap it in a clean cloth. Not perfect, but not a lost cause yet. On the table nearby, your neighbor's visiting niece, age 7 and apparently an expert in everything, wrinkles her nose. It smells like old feet. You nod solemnly. That means it's working. She giggles, but only just. Because let's be honest, she's not entirely wrong. Most medieval cheeses didn't smell like alpine breezes and gentle meadows. They smelled like exactly what they were: aged milk, stored in cool corners, rubbed with ash or mold or herbs, or if you lived near a monastery, with whatever the monks decided was holy that week. And speaking of monks, you've heard rumors of a recipe passed down by traveling friars, a cheese aged in hollowed out loaves of bread. They'd let the cheese form its own mold, and then use the bread crust as a protective barrier, nature's wax. You don't have an extra loaf big enough, but you do have some bread scraps from this morning's meal. You sprinkle a few pieces of stale rye over the surface of the cloth-wrapped wheel. It might help, it might not, but at least the mice will have something else to aim for. Historians still argue whether these bread mold techniques were intentional preservation methods or simply acts of desperation turned tradition. Some monastic records even describe the smell as divinely pungent, which is, let's be honest, the most generous phrase ever written about dairy rot. You leave the wheel near the fireplace to dry and settle into the next task, making a cheese you can actually sell at market. Not everyone appreciates bold flavors and experimental fungus. Sometimes, people just want something bland, solid, and only slightly offensive to the senses. So you begin your simple batch fresh curds, pressed overnight, then salted and wrapped tight. It's a softer cheese, meant to be eaten within days. You stack it carefully in your basket. Nestled in straw, tomorrow, you'll walk to market. You'll dodge carts and dogs and shouty fishmongers. You'll elbow your way to a corner stall and arrange your wheels like they're rare treasures. You'll shout things like mild and nutty and age just long enough, and hope no one asks too many questions about how long just enough really was. You glance back at the cheese in brine, then the wheel with bread crusts, then the neat rounds in the straw. So many cheeses, so many personalities, each wheel like a person, some bloomy and soft, others crumbly and loud, a few unpredictable and sharp-tongued. You sit by the fire and warm your feet, wondering which kind you've become, not quite fresh, not quite aged, but holding together just outside. The wind picks up. The cow lowing from her stall sounds suspiciously judgmental. You smile. She's not wrong. It's market day, and your cheese is sweating before you are. You hoist your basket over your shoulder, balancing it carefully to avoid crushing the soft rounds at the top. The straw creaks with every step. A wedge of something a little too ripe is already making its opinion known through the cloth. You pass the smithy, where the blacksmith's apprentice offers a lazy wave, his nose twitching as he catches a whiff. "Smells like you brought the good stuff today," he calls, "or something that needs to be buried," someone else mutters. You smile, but you don't stop. You've got a spot to claim. The village market is already buzzing by the time you arrive. There's a butcher advertising dubious sausages, a fishwife shouting about eels with the enthusiasm of a town crier, and at least 2 people selling cabbages of questionable lineage. You squeeze into a stall between the egg seller and the man who claims to sell healing oils but smells like goose fat. He looks over your wares and nods in solemn judgment. "Cheese," he says, like he's naming a crime. "Yes," you reply, like you're daring him to try one. You set up your display, small wheels wrapped in cloth, wedges stacked on slates, samples the brave kind speared with whittled toothpicks. You've even brought a bowl of fresh curds, still warm and sprinkled with a hint of salt, something for the curious. People start to trickle in. Some sniff, some poke, a few wrinkle their noses and scurry away. Then, finally, a woman in a faded green shawl leans in and says, "This one smells like my uncle's cellar, but in a good way." She buys 2 wedges. Success. You're not just selling cheese. You're selling stories. Survival. Salted luck wrapped in linen. But the truth is, your stall isn't the only one with cheese. The monks are here today too. They arrived like a silent dairy militia, 3 brown-robed men hauling baskets covered in embroidered cloth. Their wheels are perfect, symmetrical, branded with the monastery's seal. They don't shout. They don't even really sell. They just stand there, serene and intimidating. As customers drift toward them like flies to honeyed curds, you try not to glare. But then one of them, a younger monk, with a kind of innocent face that makes you deeply suspicious, nods at you. Just once. A slow, deliberate nod. You blink. He steps over, picks up one of your small wheels, sniffs, then breaks it open with his hands. You nearly choke. It's the brined wheel, the iffy one. But instead of recoiling, he examines the crumb, nods again, and says, "You rub this with ash." You nod. unsure if this is the start of a compliment or a warning from God. Smart, he murmurs, keeps the rind breathing. We do that with the black sage batch. You're stunned. He hands you a tiny piece from his basket, a hard, pale wedge that smells faintly of rosemary and rain. You trade. He walks away. You chew. It's sharp, dry, grassy, and dare you say it, not as good as yours. Historians still debate whether monastic cheeses truly deserve their legendary status, or if it was just good branding backed by better record keeping. Most monks had access to cleaner tools, cooler cellars, and, perhaps most importantly, team. But they didn't always have flavor. You keep chewing as a customer steps up and asks about your ash-aged wedge. You tell them it's inspired by sacred tradition, which is technically true, and it sells. By the end of the market, you've bartered 4 wheels, sold 9 wedges, and traded 1 recipe with the fishwife in exchange for pickled onions. You pack up your basket, now much lighter, and tuck the last bit of the monk's cheese into your pocket. It'll be tonight's supper. As you leave the market, you glance back once. The monks are gone. The cabbage is still there. Tragically, you walk home slowly, straw scratching your arms, the scent of dairy success clinging to your cloak like soft, funky armor. You've won the market. Not by shouting, not by praying, just by letting the cheese speak for itself. And today, it had a lot to say. You arrive at the monastery just after sunrise, your basket slung over one shoulder and a crumpled invitation in your other hand, scrawled with clumsy ink. Bring your best. Brother Yul wants a tasting. You're not sure whether this is an honor, a trap, or a form of penance. The abbey is perched on a hillside, wrapped in early fog like a freshly steamed cheesecloth. Bells toll distantly. You step past a sleeping hound and through a stone archway into a courtyard that smells like thyme, beeswax, and something fungal. The monks greet you with nods, none of them speaking. They guide you into a side chamber lined with shelves upon shelves of aging cheese wheels, brown, yellow, green speckled, some cracked, some smooth, some with names etched into them like saints, and all of them humming with invisible life. Brother Yul emerges from the gloom. He's small, round, and wearing a smock stained with milk and ash. His hair is gone, but his eyebrows are aggressive. He peers into your basket. You brought rind, he asks. Without greeting, you nod, handing him the ash-aged wheel wrapped in breadcloth. He sniffs it, taps it, holds it to his ear, then, without warning, bites directly into the side. You stifle a gasp. He chews, he swallows, he frowns, and then, blessedly, you use river salt. Yes, good. He turns, follow. You walk through corridors of stone, past drying herbs and chanting novices, until you reach the real chamber, the aging cellar. It's cold, damp, and smells like every foot in history held a meeting and never left. Here lie the oldest wheels, the sacred ones, the cheeses of record. He shows you one gray, cracked, still breathing. This, he says, was started in 1312. It has outlived 2 abbots and 3 bishops. We named it Patience. You nod, slowly backing away. Historians still debate whether monastic cheeses were actively worshipped or simply treated with more respect than most people. But in places like this, it's a fine line. You're invited to join the tasting circle, 7 monks, 7 cheeses, and you, each wheel is brought out, sliced, sniffed, passed. You try a soft one aged in mead barrels sweet and floral, with a texture like velvet and secrets. Another is wrapped in thyme and rabbit fur. One, most alarmingly, is dotted with mites. Brother Yul refers to them as flavor custodians. You try not to look directly at it. When your wheel is served, no one speaks. They chew. They breathe. One monk closes his eyes. Brother Yul finally says, "It holds." You nearly collapse in relief. You're allowed to walk the cellar alone for a few moments afterward. You trail your fingers along the cool stone walls, listen to the drip of condensation, the hum of life encased in crust and rind, and you think, maybe this is what eternity smells like. Back at the entryway, Brother Yul gives you a gift, a scroll tied with goat leather and sealed in wax. You wait until you're well down the road to open it. Inside, a list of herbs, ratios, instructions for preparing a specific brine, the abbey's recipe. You hold it to your chest for a moment, then tuck it deep into your pocket. Later that evening, back at home, you start a new wheel. You follow the steps slowly, carefully. You crush thyme, toast fenugreek, mix brine by moonlight. And before wrapping the curds, you whisper, for patience, because if the monks have taught you anything, it's this. Cheese takes time. And time, if treated well, becomes flavor. They say your cheese has worms in it. It starts as a whisper at the village, well, a passing comment from the baker's wife to the butcher's cousin's apprentice. Then, by the time you get to the apothecary to trade for dried rosemary, someone sniffs the air and says, smells like maggot butter. You freeze. You know, your wheels don't have worms. Probably you checked twice, but rumors in a medieval village spread faster than fire in a thatched roof. And worse, they stick especially when your product already smells like it lost a bet with a swamp. You hurry home and crack open the most suspicious wheel. It smells strong. Yes, and it has a slight bounce to the rind, but there are no worms. None. Not even a little leg. You squint in the afternoon light, knife in hand, dissecting the cheese like it's hiding secrets. Still clean. So where did the rumor come from? Maybe from the innkeeper who tried to bargain last week and got snubbed. Maybe from the fishmonger whose eel stew you mocked. Maybe it's just envy. Or maybe it's the truth. Because some people do make worm cheese. Yes, intentional worm cheese. In parts of the Mediterranean, there's a cheese known to be ripened by live larvae, which help ferment the inside into a soft, creamy mass. Of course, that practice is mostly centuries later and far from here. But still, some versions of it may have older roots. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants ever deliberately allowed insects to assist with aging, or if they just pretended it was intentional when a wheel went rogue. You grimace and set the knife down. Your cheese may be bold, but it is not wriggling. Yet, to be safe, you cut several wheels open and rewrap the clean ones in fresh cloth. The suspicious ones get placed out in the garden for the chickens. Let them do the final inspection. One peck, and you'll know. That evening, you notice your neighbor peering over the fence. She's old, leathery, and carries more village lore in her head than the priest has in his scrolls. Too much cheese makes bad thoughts, she says, nodding to your kitchen. You smile politely. Bad thoughts, in dreams. Yellow cheese, especially, makes people sleepwalk into the woods. You blink. She walks away. There's no record of cheese-induced dream-walking, but plenty of medieval folks believe certain foods could alter your mood. Your humors, even your morality. Cheese, being a cold and moist food in humoral theory, was sometimes blamed for melancholy, or lust, or both. You return to your curds, which are now draining quietly in their muslin wraps like nothing ever happened. Still, the rumors gnaw at you, and to fight gossip, you need allies. So you invite a few neighbors over for a quiet tasting, just a few slices, some warm bread, a hint of apple cider, and a small speech about the new batch being especially clean and certified wormless. It works mostly. The butcher grunts in approval. The carpenter eats 3 slices and asks for a wheel by Tuesday. Even the baker's wife offers a noncommittal nod. But the neighbor with the dream theory, she refuses to eat a bite. I like to keep my thoughts mine, she mutters. Fine. You send her home with a wedge anyway, labeled for insight. Later that night, you lie in bed thinking about worms, about mold, about how, in this world, even success comes with suspicion. But then, from the next room, you hear a familiar sound. The cheese cave creaks open, you tiptoe in. Holding a candle, there's your cat, licking a slice of the worm-accused wheel with slow devotion. You sigh with relief, because if anyone can sniff out hidden horror, it's him. And if he dreams of dancing rats tonight, well, at least he's had worse. You'd like to say it's just a superstition, but the way the townsfolk look at your cheese lately, especially the blue one that glows slightly in low light, has you wondering if maybe, just maybe, your dairy has crossed into the spiritual realm. This morning, the priest arrives. He doesn't knock. He doesn't smile. He simply steps into your kitchen like he owns it and gazes down at the cheese cave with a look halfway between dread and duty. We need to bless the wheels, he says. You blink. Why? There's talk. Of course there is. He walks over to a small shelf where your newest rounds rest, cheese number 21. Still young, but already ripening with attitude. He lifts a wheel, turns it, and frowns. It's blue, he says. Yes, that's on purpose. He nods slowly. as if you just told him you've made cheese using snake venom and goat dreams. He pulls out a vial of holy water. I'll sprinkle, he says, already moving. You consider arguing, but, well, it can't hurt. All right. So you step aside and let him do it. The ritual is brief. A few Latin words, a cross drawn in the air, a splash of water that makes one of the wheels hiss audibly. You both freeze. It might have just been steam. You hope. The priest finishes and turns to you. Sometimes. The devil rides in on Derry. You nod. Slowly. Respectfully. Internally baffled. It's not the first time food has needed divine assistance. In many villages, especially during plague years, cheese would be cleansed before large feasts. In some monasteries, wheels were branded with a cross to prevent spoilage. Historians still debate whether these rituals had any measurable effect, but no one wanted to risk bad luck or bad press by skipping them. You walk the priest to the gate. He offers you a chunk of communion bread in trade for a wedge of the least funky cheese. You accept. When you return inside, the cheese smells the same rich, strong, and possibly blasphemous. To be safe, you whisper an apology over Wheel 21. That evening, you hear whispers from the lane. Not voices, actual whispers. You step outside, wind in the trees, a few chickens clucking nervously, and a group of teenagers huddled near your fence, daring each other to eat the cursed wedge. You roll your eyes and toss them a crusty rind that fell on the floor earlier. They scatter like rabbits. The next day, the wheel that hissed is gone. You check everywhere shelves, baskets, even the aging cloth sacks, but it's vanished. You ask your cat. He yawns and walks away. You stare at the shelf where it once rested. Damp ring. Slight gouge in the wood. A faint scent of ash and time. Was it stolen? Did it move on its own? Did the priest take it? You consider asking, then think better of it. Cheese in the Middle Ages wasn't just food. It was sometimes a symbol, sometimes a scapegoat. In some regions, if a child fell ill after eating dairy, the cheese would be burned and buried. In others, people hung cheese wheels in the eaves to ward off witches. So if one of your wheels wants to vanish under cover of night, you're not going to chase it. You light a candle near the shelf, just in case. Later, he sends a note word of your cheese has reached the next village. They're curious. They want a wheel, the blue one, if possible. You don't have the heart to tell them that one left on its own. So you start a new batch. Same mold, same milk, same cave. This time, you hang a clove of garlic near the press, for balance, for luck, for whatever forces might be watching. 'Cause whether it's bacteria or blessing, one thing's clear. This cheese has a life of its own, and you're just trying to keep up. You're packing cheese for a journey, and not just any journey. A traveling knight has requested provisions for his upcoming expedition, which apparently includes 2 swords, 3 horses, 1 squire, and a mild cheese that won't haunt the nostrils. You try not to be offended. You wrap 3 modest wheels in waxed cloth and tuck them into a wooden chest lined with straw. They're fresh, young, barely aged safe. If a little boring, the knight wants cheese that won't argue with the meat, which is a polite way of saying no mold, no funk, and absolutely nothing that bites back. You consider slipping in a wedge of the spicy blue just for fun, but you're not quite that bold. Not yet. You fasten the chest with rope and help the squire load it onto a cart. The knight doesn't make eye contact. He's too busy adjusting the strap of his scabbard and squinting into the horizon like it owes him money. Still, he nods. You've served the realm. High praise. You suppose. He rides off, and you return to your kitchen. Half amused, half exhausted, there's another wheel to tend to, and a curious bubbling sound coming from your second brine vat that you're 60% sure is just fermentation. But the real trouble begins that night. The bells ring late, well past supper. A messenger, breathless and mud-caked, arrives with news. The knight has fallen ill. Your heart seizes. He says it's the cheese. The boy gasps. Of course he does. You throw on your cloak and follow the messenger out of town to a roadside camp, where the knight lies sprawled on a blanket, clutching his stomach like it insulted his lineage. He groans, moans, swears vengeance on all things dairy. The squire looks panicked. It was the soft one, he says. We ate it with roast duck. You kneel beside the knight, who groans again and mutters, betrayed by curds. You ask a few questions. He didn't boil the duck properly. I'd get late. chased it with ale of unknown origin. It wasn't the cheese. You're sure? Probably. Still. You apologize and offer a mild herb-infused wedge from your bag. He waves it off like it's poison. The squire accepts it, pockets it for later. Historians still argue whether cheese caused outbreaks of illness or merely took the blame. In plague years, it was common to avoid heavy foods, and cheese was often listed among them alongside onions, garlic, and anything night-cooked. But more often than not, it was the water, or the meat, or simply bad luck. Back in your kitchen the next morning, you scrub the entire curing shelf. Just to be safe, you double salt the brine. You boil your cloths and dry them in the sun. And then you sit and wonder, because even if the knight recovers and he will, you're fairly certain the seed of doubt has been planted. And doubt in a small village is like mold. Once it settles in, it spreads fast. By noon, someone asks if your cheese can cause gallbladder storms. You don't know what that means. By evening, a child points at your cellar and whispers, "That's where the poison lives." You sigh. You make a new batch. This one you age under cloth, under lock, under silence. And that night, for comfort, you slice into a cheese that does bite back sharp, salty, streaked with veins and memory. You eat it slowly and remind yourself that even nights fall. But cheese endures. The cellar is emptier than it should be. It's not dramatic, just a little too quiet, a little too echoey. You count your remaining wheels and feel a familiar churn in your gut. Something's off. Not theft, just taxes. You hear the creak at the gate before the knock. Then the voice. Royal tithe collection. Wonderful. The cheese tax is due. Every villager owes a portion of their dairy output to the local steward, who claims he sends it upstream, which either means the royal court or, more likely, his brother-in-law's dinner table. Regardless, the rules are clear. 2 wheels, or an equal measure in soft cheese, plus 1 fresh loaf and a chicken optional, but recommended if you value future leniency, you grab your second best wheels and place them on the table. Not your youngest cheese, but not your best. You wrap them in cloth, tie them with twine, and set them beside the door. You'll pretend that's all you have, but you and the cellar both know better. Downstairs, behind the shelf of pickled walnuts, is your secret. A small stash of true aging wheels, earthy, solid, fragrant with promise. You cover them with loose stones and mark the spot with a decoy sack of oats. The collector arrives just as you finish your tea. He's tall, wearing more velvet than his station can justify, and carrying a wax tablet smeared with names. He enters your kitchen like a man inspecting livestock. 2 wheels, he asks. You nod. Any butter? You shake your head. Spoiled. He sniffs the air. Smells fine to me. That's the soap. He doesn't laugh. You hand over the wheels. He pokes them, then places them into a sack carried by his assistant, a boy who looks about 12 and has cheese on his fingers already. Keep the good stuff for yourself. I see, the steward mutters. I'd never, you reply, in your most innocent tone. He scans your kitchen. You've gotten better since last year. This smells less tragic. Thank you. You say, I changed cows. Historians still argue whether the cheese tax was enforced with fairness or fear. In some regions, collectors were known to confiscate entire shelves by mistake. In others, villagers built false walls, decoy wheels, or buried cheese in grain sacks. Cheese hiding was an art form, and you are a student of it. Once the steward leaves, you descend into the cellar. The air is cool, the stones damp. You check the oat sack. The cheese is still there, still firm, still safe. You press your hand to the top wheel and exhale slowly. You survived another tithe, but barely. The next day, you visit the baker and offer him a trade. 1 small wheel of your ash-aged cheese for 2 loaves, and a promise that if anyone asks, you've been sick with dairy fatigue. He agrees. You both know this is part of the dance. Later that week, you hear a new rumor. The steward's wife served your cheese at her sister's wedding. The guests called it bold. 1 man cried. You're not sure if that's good or bad, but you smile anyway, because the cheese they took wasn't your best, and your best, still aging, still hidden, still yours. It starts with a knock. Not the polite kind, the urgent kind, the kind that says, there's been a cheese incident. You open the door to find young Jamin from the mill, breathless and wide-eyed, clutching a cloth-wrapped bundle like it contains either treasure or catastrophe. She ate it. He blurts. All of it. The whole wedge. You blink. Who? My aunt. The blue one with the cracked rind. Your aunt, or the cheese. He doesn't laugh. Not even a twitch. She says it spoke to her. Said it was alive. You pause. Already picturing the worst. Hallucinations. Curses. Someone blaming Derry for seeing ghosts again. You usher him inside. Unwrap the bundle. And take a look. It's your wheel. Candlelight. Or what's left of it. Half eaten. Crumbly. And glowing faintly at the edges. You didn't add anything phosphorescent. But maybe... No. Surely not. You break off a piece and sniff. Funky. Assertive. Bold. Definitely alive. But in a fine French kitchen sort of way, not a summon spirits way. Still. You don't taste it. Not yet. Jamin sits at your table, wringing his cap in his hands. She says the cheese told her about the river, about the old well, about the cat. The cat, it said he's not who we think. You glance at your cat, currently asleep in a sunbeam with a look of pure betrayal that only felines can manage. Historians still argue whether cheese was believed to carry messages, visions, or simply gas. In several 15th century texts, certain cheeses were described as divining, often made during solstices, full moons, or dreams. A few even claimed to predict the weather or love. Usually, though, they just caused indigestion. You send Jamin home with a wedge of very boring cheese, mild, soft, safe. You tell him to brew ginger tea and keep his aunt away from candlelight. That night, you sit in the cellar and stare at the rest of the batch. You've aged cheeses before, but this one feels intentional. It has lines, fissures, patterns in the rind that almost resemble script. You trace them with your finger, half expecting them to rearrange like a living map. You really need sleep, so you slice a wedge and eat it, just to see, and it's spectacular. Sharp, rich, earthy, like biting into time. Not spoiled, not rotten, just layered, deep. A cheese with history and personality. And, if you're honest, it does whisper. Not with words, just with memory. You taste the cold of the cave, the salt of the river, the smoke from a last winter's fire, the herb-scented cloth you wrapped it in with shaking hands. You chew slowly, you close your eyes, and you remember the monk who said, "It holds," he was right. You lean back in your chair and exhale, letting the aftertaste settle on your tongue. This isn't cursed cheese. This is earned cheese. The kind that carries stories in its rind, that softens with patience, that doesn't need to scream to be heard. The kind of cheese that only someone who has buried wheels, fought off worms, whispered prayers to Kurds, and survived the tax collector would know how to make. You wrap the rest of the wheel in cloth marked with charcoal, just a single stripe, like a seal, and place it on the top shelf of your cave. Not for sale, not for trade, just for keeping, because not all cheese is made to be shared. Some is made to be remembered. The first snow falls like sifted flour soft, slow, and settling in every crack of the village. Your cheese cave grows colder, its damp stones sweating less, the air inside turning crisp and quiet. Its aging season, prime and perfect, but only if you can keep the frost from biting too deep. You light a small fire near the curing shelf, just enough warmth to keep the wheels from stiffening into soap. The flickering light casts long, round shadows, as if the cheeses themselves are watching, waiting, dreaming. It's time to rotate. You crouch, palms cold against the aging boards, and begin your ritual flip. Sniff, tap, turn, flip, sniff, tap, turn. The wheels grunt under your touch. One has crusted too hard. You'll need to soften it with cider. Another is growing a faint pink blush, likely from the rosewater cloth you reused too many times. Not ideal, but not fatal. Then there's the ash-aged blue, still wrapped in its breadcloth cocoon. You unroll it and pause. The rind has cracked just barely, a split, no longer than your thumb, but it reveals veins of green, vivid and laced with white crystals like frost over stone. You whistle softly. It's a gamble, but you'll finish aging it anyway. You rub it with a cloth soaked in juniper oil. Not traditional, but you've heard from a spice seller that some coastal towns used it to ward off bitterness and ghosts. You're not sure which you're more worried about. You place it back on the shelf and write a note in chalk above it. Let it speak. You mean it literally? This cheese might hum if left alone too long. Outside. The village creaks under snow. Smoke drifts lazily from chimneys. The baker's boy trudges past with a cart of burnt crusts and the last of the autumn apples. You wave inside. The cave is quiet again, but the silence is earned. This is the part of cheesemaking few talk about, the waiting, the slow tension, the not knowing. Historians still argue whether winter cheeses were better because of slower aging, or simply because there were fewer distractions, no fields to tend, fewer feasts to prepare. Whatever the case, winter cheese holds more memory. It breathes differently. You sit on the cellar step, sipping warm cider from a wooden cup, and listen to the wheels settle into themselves. Somewhere behind you, a mouse dares to squeak. You throw a pebble, it flees. The cellar is yours again. The next day, Dahi arrives. She's brought a visitor, a merchant from the coast, wrapped in furs and interest. He's heard of your blue. He wants to try it. You glance at the chalk. Let it speak. Not yet. So you serve him a different wheel, one aged in cider, rind rubbed with dried nettle. He chews thoughtfully, then nods. You have quiet cheese. He says, "That's rare." You smile. It speaks when it's ready. He leaves 2 coins and a jar of something salty and pickled. You don't ask what. That evening, you light another fire and unwrap the ash-aged blue again. The crack is widened slightly. You lean close, and for just a moment, the scent wafting from within is not just earthy or herbal or tangy. It's reassuring, like bread left out for someone's return, like wool left warm by another body. You wrap it again. Tightly, because soon it will be ready. And when it is, you'll listen. The festival arrives with bells, frost, and too much mead. It's the feast of St. Ulrich, patron of patience, cold toes, and inexplicably, dairy handlers. Every year, the villagers hang tiny wheels of cheese from pine branches, light wax tapers beside barrels, and eat until they either collapse from joy or indigestion. This year, they've asked you to judge the cheese contest. You're honored and terrified. You take your judging duties seriously, no bribes, no bias, that's my cousin's curd kind of favoritism, just honest nose-to-rind evaluation. The table is set in the town square. Snow sparkles in the morning light. The mayor, dressed in his once-a-year purple robe, welcomes everyone like a man who has tasted too much cheese and intends to do it again. 12 wheels sit before you, all unlabeled. You inspect them one by one, some too soft, some too dry, one so pungent that you politely refuse to describe it out loud. You nibble, swallow, sip warm beer to clear your palate. Then you hit contestant number 9, a small, ash-coated wheel. You cut it open and gasp. Just a little, it's yours. Not from your shelf, but unmistakably yours. A cheese you traded weeks ago for a sack of dried cherries. You recognize the texture, the faint trail of juniper, the delicate veining. You chew slowly, let it melt. It's perfect, and also slightly insulting that it made it back to you like a boomerang of forgotten glory. You write a number next to it, Naprist, Sebkofti, because you're honest, and, a slightly better batch is still aging on your top shelf at home. The winner is announced. The ash-aged wedge, gifted anonymously by the local candlemaker's niece, who blushes and accepts a ribbon. You pretend to be surprised. After the ceremony, you catch her by the bread stall. You aged that one. She shrugs. Found it in the larder. My uncle said it came from someone with serious eyebrows. You nod. Good instincts. You say, she grins. It made my brother dream about bees. You both agree that's probably fine. Historians still argue whether village cheese contests were judged fairly or just turned into popularity votes wrapped in dairy. Some records show elaborate ceremonies. Others suggest they were just excuses to sample everything under the guise of diplomacy. Either way, they mattered. Because cheese isn't just food, it's pride, legacy, proof that someone, somewhere, had the skill and patience to turn milk into memory. That night, the festival spills into the tavern. Someone sings a song about a shepherd's curdled heartbreak. You dance a little, eat a lot, and even serve slices of a rind-washed wedge that nobody has the courage to identify. You save your last wedge for Dahi, who appears just before midnight, cheeks pink from cold and joy. It was yours. Wasn't it? She asks, unwrapping the winning wheel. You don't answer. She slices it, passes you a piece. You eat. It's soft, assertive, complex, and somehow still a little bit you. Same again next year, she asks. You nod. But next time, I'll enter my best, and somewhere, back in your cellar, the last blue wheel waits, still humming, still alive, still becoming. You wake to the sound of silence. That deep winter stillness where even the wind seems to take a breath and the village exhales in gentle hibernation. The hearth has gone to embers. Your cat sleeps curled like a comma at your feet. Outside, the world is powdered with new snow. And today, finally, it's time. You descend to the cellar slowly, lantern in hand. The stone steps are damp with condensation. Your breath puffs out in tiny clouds. You pass the row of aging rounds, the half-empty cider barrel, the corner where the oat sack used to guard your secret stash. You stop in front of the top shelf. The blue wheel rests there, cloth lightly dusted with ash, faint lines of green running like veins beneath its outer skin. The crack you once worried over is now a gentle fissure, as if the cheese itself has aged into a wise smile. You unwrap it carefully, like opening a letter from an old friend. The scent rises up layered, deep, earthy, nutty, and sharp. It smells like time, like the cellar, like every mistake you learned from, every batch you buried, every rumor you outlived. You place it on the wooden table and cut it open. It's beautiful, marbled with color, dense yet yielding. Each slice releases a little warmth, a little memory. You prepare a plate with slices of dark rye, pickled onions, and a jar of Dahi's pear preserves. A feast for one. You take a bite, and the room softens. The cheese melts into everything sweet, tangy, alive. You taste frost, river salt, and stories. You remember the monk's nod, the market's noise, the steward's suspicion, the dreams and doubts and arguments the cheese held in silence. You chew slowly. This is not a cheese for everyone. It's too bold, too strange, too unwilling to compromise. But for you, it's perfect. You wrap the rest in fresh cloth and mark it with charcoal again this time. Not let it speak. But it spoke. The cellar feels warmer. Later, Dahi stops by. You pour cider and serve 2 thin slices. She chews quietly, then exhales. It tastes like a year, she says. You nod. A loud one. She laughs, then sets down her cup. You know they'll ask for more. You sigh. You do, but that's the strange magic of cheese, isn't it? You lose some, you hide some, you age what you can and hope it turns out right. And once in a while, it gives back more than it took. You walk her to the door, lantern held high. Outside, the snow falls again, covering footsteps, softening roofs, hush-lulling the village into peaceful forgetfulness. Inside, the cellar waits, not empty, just ready. And so, you place one last wheel on the shelf, young, unaged, full of questions. You press your palm to its cloth-wrapped side and whisper, "Patience," and then you go upstairs, light a candle, and drift into the quiet, letting the year and the cheese rest. And now, the cellar fades, the shelves blur, the scent of rind and brine and quiet determination gives way to something even gentler, your own breath. Steady now, slow. The flicker of the lantern becomes the soft glow behind your eyelids. You let your shoulders drop. Your thoughts settle like dust on old wood, like ash on an aging wheel. Every image from tonight, every whisper of milk warmed at dawn, every wheel hidden behind stone, every superstition, every brave taste sinks into stillness. No more nights to impress, no tax to dodge, no cracked rinds or chattering villagers, just you, and that memory of one perfect slice, crumbling between your fingers, dissolving with a sigh on your tongue. Even the cheese cave goes quiet now, content with its secrets. The stories held in the rind have been told, and the rest can wait until spring. So lie still, let the cold stone cradle your dreams. Let the moonlight pool at the edges of your blankets. Let the warmth of the curdled year hum gently around you. Not loud, not sharp, just mellow. Like a promise. You've done enough. You've aged well. You've made it. Now, sleep. Let your thoughts melt, one by one, like soft cheese on warm bread. Let go and drift. Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a bite carefully out of history's most overlooked weapon of dental destruction, old bread. Picture this. You wake up in a damp thatched cottage. Your straw mattress has poked you in all the wrong places. You drag yourself back from the mill, Flour sack balanced on one shoulder, arms jelly from all the winnowing and walking. And as you finally set the bag down near your hearth, you hear it? The grinding stones go, still buzzing faintly in your ears. It's the medieval version of tinnitus, and you're not the only one who hears it. Everyone in the village walks around with the same dull ache behind their temples from the sound of grain meeting granite, over and over again. You untie the sack and take a peek. Flour. Well, mostly flour. Because nestled in the mix are the tiny, gritty reminders that your food was ground between giant slabs of rock. You run your fingers through it, and sure enough, there's a faint texture, almost sandy. Not like beach sand. More like the stuff that chews on your enamel when you least expect it. You could try sifting. You do try sifting, but your cloth sieve is homemade and stretched too loose. The flour slips through, but the grit dances right on in, smug as a landlord collecting rent. And that's not even the worst of it. You don't know what the miller's been grinding before your sack rolled in. Rye, barley, acorns. A batch of flour that accidentally sat through a week of summer humidity and turned half alive. One time, he even tried chestnut flour and clogged the whole thing for days. Oh, and let's not forget about rat bones. Because, yes, occasionally someone small and furry gets caught between the stones. The village rumor mill, far more efficient than the grain one swears last winter's sour batch, came from a particularly unlucky rodent who never saw it coming. Historians still argue whether the frequency of foreign objects in medieval flour has been exaggerated. Some believe sifting techniques were more advanced than we assume. Others suggest people simply developed incredibly durable digestive tracts and deeply suspicious attitudes toward white bread. Either way, you know what's in your flour. You've seen the bits of bran, the occasional speck of pebble, the way it glows faintly in torchlight, like it's daring you to bake with it. Still, you carry on, because what else can you do? You don't have access to bolted flour, that finely sifted stuff that nobles eat, soft as snow and white as lies. That's made from the heart of the grain, stripped of all its texture and flavor, and about as accessible to you as a silk tunic. So instead, you pour your flour into a bowl, add a bit of water, a pinch of salt if you're lucky, and something vaguely yeasty like the sour lump you've been nursing in a crock since spring. It smells like regret and boiled socks, but it bubbles slightly when warm, so it lives another day. You mix and mix and mix. The dough forms reluctantly, sticky and lumpy and grumbling at your hands like it knows it's going to be overworked. Which it will be, because you have to knead the life into it, literally. There's no mixer, no timer, no YouTube tutorial from a cheerful baker with perfect lighting. Just your own arms, elbows, and the memory of how your mother used to fold the dough like she was punishing it for existing. You knead until your forearms ache, until your palms burn, until the dough finally stops clinging like a desperate lover and starts to hold its shape with a grudging sort of dignity. And then you leave it, wrapped in cloth, set beside the hearth. Praying the fire's warmth is enough to wake the yeast without killing it. This is the moment where old bread is born. Because if your yeast is tired, or your flour too rough, or your timing slightly off, your beautiful dough ball will rise just enough to give you hope, and then collapse like a bad souffle. You'll still bake it. You have to. There's no flour left. But you already know it's going to be dense, a loaf with the bounce of limestone and the charm of a doorstop. And when it cools, and you try to slice it with your one halfway sharp knife, it will flake into uneven chunks, crust so hard it nearly shatters your cutting board. Crumbs so tight you could use it as insulation. Still, it's bread, and you'll eat it. You'll eat all of it, even the parts that sound like gravel when you chew. The dough has risen sort of. It looks like it tried its best. A little puff here, a wrinkle there. But mostly, it sits in the bowl with the energy of a bored dog, unwilling to do more than exist. You prod it with your fingers. It springs back slightly, then sulks. Time to bake. You dust the table with what little flour you have left, ignoring the faint crunch and shape the loaf. It resists. It's stiff. It's like working with mildly offended clay. You smooth the edges, press a crude cross into the top, both tradition and insurance, and leave it to rest. Just long enough to stoke the fire, 'cause now it's you versus the oven. You open the hearth door and wince as a puff of smoke curls around your face. The heat is uneven. The stones cracked, and the chimney argues with the wind. You toss in more twigs, then a thicker log, then blow gently, then not so gently until flames lick the back wall like they've remembered how to behave. No thermometer, no timer, just your hand hovering in front of the opening, guessing by feel whether it's bread hot or too hot, even for hubris. You slide the loaf in and hope while it bakes. You tidy a little, you wipe crumbs with your sleeve, mutter about flour prices, and wonder if maybe you should have let the dough sit longer, or kneaded it more, or added something herbs, maybe, or a bit of lard from the jar that may or may not be going slightly green around the rim. But it's too late. You smell it first. Toasty, smoky, dense. It's a promising scent, until a sharp bitterness creeps in. That's the crust crisping into something less golden and more defensive armor. You pull it from the oven with a cloth-wrapped hand and stare. It's small. It's hard. It thunks when you tap it like a stubborn melon or an ominous drum. You set it on the board and wait. Cutting now would tear it apart. Cutting later might break your knife. Historians still argue whether medieval people enjoyed their bread or simply tolerated it. Some describe the crust as hearty and sustaining. Others liken it to roofing tile. In certain monastic communities, old loaves were used for writing practice, literally inscribing notes onto crust before eating the message. Deliciously passive-aggressive. Eventually, you take the knife to it. It doesn't slice so much as resist. You press harder, and the crust cracks like dry wood. The interior is grayish-brown, tight, slightly sticky, not raw, not quite, but no one's calling it fluffy. You chew slowly, and it crunches not in the satisfying way, but in the oh no, was that a tooth kind of way. You fish a fleck from your molars. It's probably stone, possibly oat husk, or optimism. Crumbling under pressure, still, it's food. You dip it in broth. Better? You smear it with cheese. Marginally improved. You try to soften it with wine. Now it's chewy wine sponge, which isn't a thing, but probably should be. By the third bite, your jaw has questions. By the fifth, it has filed a formal complaint. You switch sides of your mouth like it'll make a difference. It doesn't, but you keep going. Because it's bread, it's yours, and there won't be more until next week. Unless you want to start bartering socks or stories for a slice of the baker's second best. And besides, there's always stew. Old bread soaks up stew like a champ. You dunk a hunk and smile. Just a little, because even with the crunch, the questionable bits, the overwhelming jaw workout, it's warm, it's filling, it's yours. You'd like to believe bread is for everyone, but by now, you've learned not all loaves are created equal. Your hard-won, jaw-testing brick of sustenance barely compares to the pillowy dreams of the manor kitchen. The Lord's table doesn't serve bread, it serves manchet, a soft, snowy white delicacy so far removed from your barley bricks that calling them both bread feels slightly offensive. Manchet is made from bolted flour, passed through fine sieves, pounded smooth, and kneaded with eggs, milk, and sometimes even butter. The result, a tender, fragrant roll that doesn't threaten dental integrity. A bread that flakes, not cracks, that yields, not resists. You've seen it once, at the annual fair, when the steward allowed commoners to witness a noble feast witness, not taste. You remember watching a young squire bite into a roll and smile. No chewing struggle, no broken molars, just joy. Back in your kitchen, your dough doesn't get that treatment. You use brand-heavy flour, coarse and wild. What the miller hands you is second-rate by default, and if you're caught complaining, the steward might remind you. You've got the baker's privilege. That privilege means you get to use the communal oven. After the noble's bread has been baked, after the heat has dropped, after the stones have cooled. It's a delicate dance. Rush to prep your dough while there's still enough fire to bake it. Don't linger, or your crust will be soggy. Don't show up too early, or you'll be turned away. And don't ever outshine the noble's loaf. Historians still argue whether this baker's privilege was seen as a genuine social right or a cleverly disguised system of rationed access. Some records describe a fair rotation, others hint at bribes, favoritism, and feuds between neighbors over who scorched whose loaf last week. You know the truth. It's a bit of both. Today, you've snagged a good slot, just late enough that the heat is even, just early enough that no one's elbowed you in line. You cradle your dough like an offering as you approach the oven. The village baker brought, soot-faced, and always suspicious nods without smiling. He slides the loaves in, one by one. You whisper a quick hope, not too burnt, not too dense, not full of air pockets. Then you wait and try not to stare at the nobleman's bread, cooling on a wooden plank nearby, round and golden. It practically glows in the firelight. It smells like butter, like wealth, like things you'll probably never taste without disguise or theft. You pretend not to care. Your loaf comes out. It's respectable, rounded at the edges, firm, holding together without crumbling. You can already tell the crust will need a sturdy knife, but the middle might be soft enough to chew without injury. You thank the baker with a nod. He doesn't respond. Outside, the air smells like smoke and steam and old yeast. You head home, loaf tucked in your cloak, warmth against your ribs. It's not manchet, but it's yours, and no one will take it. Tonight, it will rest on the board beside a pot of stew. And tomorrow, maybe you'll trade a slice for a neighbor's dried apples. Even old bread can have value. After all, especially when no one's watching, it's dough time again. Because bread waits for no one, not even your aching arms or your blistered palms. The last loaf is nearly gone, and the only thing left on the table is a single heel so dry it could moonlight as building material. So you gather your tools, a dented bowl, a splash of water from the crock, a fistful of yesterday's starter, which smells faintly of vinegar and whetstone, and your trusty flour, still speckled with invisible betrayal. You begin to mix. The flour clings to the water reluctantly. The starter bubbles faintly like it's unsure about this arrangement, and your spoon creaks with every lazy stir. But eventually, the dough comes together, and then the kneading begins. You roll up your sleeves and brace yourself, because kneading isn't romantic. It's not graceful. It's not what the paintings show. There's no lovely, smiling peasant woman effortlessly folding silk-soft dough in a sunny window. No, you are hunched, sweating, elbows flying, pressing the dough like it owes you money. It sticks to everything. The bowl, your hands, your hair. You wipe your forehead with the back of your wrist and accidentally add a little flour to your face. Now you look like you've lost a brawl with a bakery. Kneading takes time. A lot of it, you fold and press and turn and fold again. You count your strokes. You start mumbling ancient bread rhymes you barely remember. 1 fold for the gods, 2 for the guests, 3 for the rats, 4 for the rest. Your cat watches from the corner, unimpressed. Eventually, the dough begins to fight back less. It smooths out, becomes something resembling pliable, and now, the real challenge begins. Rising, you wrap it in cloth. Nestle it near the hearth, not too close, or it'll bake instead of rise and wait. This is the part no one respects. The long, nervous watching, because your dough is alive now. Or at least you hope it is. If the yeast is feeling sulky, or the air is too cold, or someone even thinks about opening a window, the whole thing might sulk into a lifeless lump. You peek, still nothing. You warm a rock near the fire, tuck it beside the bowl like a makeshift hot water bottle, and whisper at the dough like it's a sleeping child. Come on, just a little puff. I'm not asking for clouds. Historians still argue whether medieval bakers had a consistent method for knowing if dough had risen enough. Some say they used touch and smell. Others suggest they simply waited until it looked less sad. You pass the time by prepping the baking surface. In your case, it's a flat stone board you salvaged from the edge of the well, scrubbed clean enough and dusted with a bit of flour and hope. Some households used wooden boards. Others baked in clay pots. You once tried that, your pot cracked. And you still haven't found all the pieces. Finally, your dough shows signs of life. A gentle dome. A little give. It springs back just enough. It's ready. You flour your hands, gently coax it out of the bowl, and begin shaping, not too rough. You've worked too hard to punch it back into submission. You press and pat, tuck the edges, smooth the top. You slice a shallow mark across the surface with a sharp sliver of bone. Across, because it's tradition and superstition. And, let's be honest, insurance. Now comes the transfer to the oven, and now comes the prayer. Because you've kneaded until your arms felt like soup. You've waited like a statue beside the fire, and now you send this dough into the flames, not knowing if it'll become food or failure. It slides in with a sigh, and you exhale. Finally, you lean back against the wall, flour-streaked and exhausted, and think, maybe this time the loaf will thank you, or at least not try to shatter your teeth. The fire crackles in its usual moody way, half warm comfort, half unpredictable tantrum. You crouch near the oven's mouth, poking the embers with a blackened stick, coaxing the heat to hold steady. The stones inside pulse gently with stored warmth, and your loaf, nestled inside on a flat scrap of slate, begins its slow transformation. But nothing's guaranteed, because medieval ovens, unlike modern ones, are temperamental creatures. They have no knobs, no timers, no preheat to 375 degrees instructions. Just your hand, your eyes, and years of accumulated kitchen instinct, none of which helps when your bread decides to act like a lump of sullen clay. You squint inside. The crust is browning fast, maybe too fast. You crack the door to let out some heat, then immediately regret it as a gust of cold air rushes in, and the fire lets out an offended hiss. You throw on a handful of straw to revive it. The flames leap, singe your sleeve, and briefly make the kitchen smell like scorched laundry. Perfect. Still, the loaf is baking. You can tell by the scent smoky, nutty, dense. It smells like labor and hunger and quiet hope. But it's fragile. If the bottom gets too close to the coals, it'll char black and bitter. If the top rises too fast, it'll split like a volcano. If the inside stays raw, it'll be gummy and damp and remind you of that one failed loaf you fed to the pigs. Even they looked insulted. So you do what every good baker does. You hover. Historians still argue whether home cooks had a real grasp of oven temperatures or just crossed their fingers and hoped for edible. There's some evidence of people using test loaves, tiny rounds sacrificed in advance, or relying on time-measured chance or candle drip rituals to estimate when the oven was just right. You mostly go by instinct and blind panic. Eventually, the loaf gives off that telltale thump when you tap the crust. Not hollow exactly, but done. You grab the paddle, slide it under, and ease the bread out of the fire's embrace like rescuing a sleeping child from a too warm bed. It looks, okay, a little squat, a little scorched on one side, but intact. You carry it to the table, gently, like you're trying not to wake a loaf that might be cranky. Now the waiting begins again, because you can't slice it hot. You've tried that before. The inside becomes a gooey mess. The crust collapses, and the whole thing cools into a wrinkled disappointment. So you wait and stare and inhale and maybe prod it once or twice with your knife, just to feel powerful. Eventually, it's cool enough. You slice. The crust cracks a good sign. Not too brittle, not too soft. The inside, still a little dense. There's a line where the steam didn't quite finish its magic. But it's bread, edible bread, chewable-ish. You chew your first bite slowly, cautiously, like greeting a dog you're not sure likes you. The crust is chewy. The crumb is tight. The flavor, sour, deep, grainy, real. It tastes like effort. And maybe that's the point. Bread wasn't meant to be easy. It was meant to feed, to fill, to stretch across days and soak up broth and hold you over when the stew was thin and the ale was weak. It was meant to last. You smear a bit of fat on it, a dab of lard, maybe a smear of bean paste. Whatever your shelf has to offer, you chew again, and the flavor opens up. Smoke. The grain, salt. Team, this loaf will do. You slice the rest carefully. One chunk for today, one for tomorrow. The heel wrapped in cloth for later. Nothing wasted. Outside. The sky darkens. Inside. The fire settles, and on the table, your loaf waits. Hard-earned. A little crooked. Still warm. Still yours. You sit back in your chair, chewing slowly, and it hits you, this crust is not messing around. Your jaw moves in that deliberate way it does when you're not entirely sure you're winning the fight. One side crunches, the other side braces, and somewhere between your molars you feel a small pop that makes you pause and wonder, was that the bread or a tiny piece of you? Because the truth is, this crust wasn't made to be gentle, it was made to survive. You take another bite. Adjusting your technique like a seasoned warrior angle the loaf. Attack with your molars first. Soften it with a little broth if necessary. You've learned, you've adapted, because if you don't, you might actually chip a tooth. And people did. Historians still argue whether dental damage in medieval skulls was caused more by poor hygiene or by things like, oh, I don't know, chewing actual pebbles embedded in daily bread. It's not just flour dust or grit from the millstones, it's hardened crusts. aged loaves. And bread so stale, you'd swear it was training to be a roof tile. You think back to that one winter, harsh and long, when flour was scarce and the village oven only fired twice a month. The loaves, then, practically indestructible. People stored them in sacks or clay pots. When ready to eat, they didn't slice them, they chiseled them. Some soaked them in wine. Others grated them into soups. You tried dropping one from a height to crack it open. It dented the floor. Bread that sat too long dries into something between sponge and stone. And yet, it doesn't spoil easily. That's the trade-off. It's edible, kind of, eventually. Today's loaf is fresh by comparison. Still, the crust demands respect. You glance around your little kitchen. A small crock of soft cheese sits waiting. Perfect. You smear a bit on a warm slice, and the contrast is heavenly smooth on rough, soft on hard. It makes the whole ordeal feel almost luxurious. But then you think of the other option, the soft, crustless, blessedly chewable bread of the rich. Manchet. You've seen a noble tear into it with fingers. No knife needed. They dab gravy from their chins with linen while the loaf just yields. It's a pillow masquerading as food. Your bread is not a pillow. It is a stone forged in fire and duty. Still, it nourishes you in a way Manchet never could. It reminds you you've earned your meal. You've worked for it, ground it, kneaded it, stoked the fire that gave it form. There's honor in that, even if your jaw muscles are starting to burn like you've just eaten a loaf-shaped kettlebell. You chew, smile cautiously. Then remember the old saying, the crust keeps the devil out. You don't know who said it first. Maybe a monk. Maybe a mother. Maybe someone just really tired of getting judged for hard loaves. Either way, it's a belief that stuck. A thick crust wasn't just survival, it was spiritual armor. It protected the inside, kept the bread sacred, but pure, untainted by rot or demons or wandering hands. And it's funny, but as you sit there chewing, you feel that in your bones. This bread is your fortress. Your flavorless, jaw-challenging, slightly smoky fortress. You dunk another chunk in broth. This time it yields easier. The warmth makes the crust tender, the crumb rich. You taste the grain, the fire, the faint bitterness of life, the tiny sweetness of survival. You chew and realize this bread might not love you, but it respects you. You reach for another slice, one of the thicker ones, slightly uneven, baked just enough to keep its shape, but soft enough to tear if you're feeling lazy. You're not. You cut, because you're civilized. Mostly, you break the piece open and look at the crumb. Brown, dense, speckled with tiny flecks of bran and mystery. Not mold. Not yet. Maybe in 2 days. Maybe less if the rain returns. But right now, it's fine. It's edible. It's yours. And it is unmistakably black bread, the bread of the peasants. The farmers, the tired and the hungry, coarse rye. Sometimes barley, maybe a little oat if you're lucky or desperate. It's filling. Sure, even healthy, if you believe the village healer who insists rough bread keeps the bowels moving like a church bell. Still, it's a far cry from the bleached, butter-soft Manchet loaf you dreamt about as a child. You tear a chunk off and nibble. The crust tastes like yesterday's fire. The inside tastes like the field, earthy, stubborn, strangely alive. There's a hint of sourness, natural fermentation. They say you think it might be bitterness? Too, because black bread isn't just food. It's a badge, a social one. You've seen the difference at festivals. Nobles pile Manchet on silver plates, soft as clouds, crust trimmed off like it's an insult. They never chew long. They never struggle. Their bread doesn't fight back. Yours does. And that says something. Historians still argue whether black bread was reviled or simply normalized by the lower classes. Some sources suggest people learned to love its tang and heft. Others describe it as the bare minimum, a daily chore you had to eat. It's likely both. Depends on the day, the mood, the quality of your teeth. Today, you appreciate it, sort of, because this loaf, dense and honest, has a purpose. It fills you up. It keeps you warm. It stays edible even when you forget it behind the hearth for a week, and it gets a bit firm. You remember that winter when the stew was thin and the bread wasn't, and how you soaked it, shredded it, mashed it with herbs and roots to trick your tongue into thinking it was a meal. You made it work. You always make it work. Still, you wonder, what if you had wheat, not this scrappy? Dirt-colored rye that grows in bad soil and laughs at your sickle. Real wheat, soft wheat, white wheat, the kind grown in noble fields, protected from floods and frost by rows of well-paid men with horses and fences and security. You sigh. You chew. You remember that miller's apprentice bragging about eating a slice of manchet last month, leftovers from the manor. Said it was like biting clouds made of milk. You didn't believe him. Still don't. But you thought about it for days. Your loaf but your loaf will last. You can slice it thick, spread it with bean mash, or crumble it into your soup. You can tuck it into a pocket and still find it edible by sunset. You can even use it to wedge open a stubborn door. Try that with manchet. Outside, a breeze rattles the shutters. You glance at your crock of pickled onions, thinking they might go well with your next bite. Sharp, sour, strong just like the bread. You smile. This meal might not be fancy, but it's yours. It's honest. It's enough. And for today, that's all it needs to be. The loaf is nearly half gone now. Crumbs scattered across the table like tiny battlefield survivors. Crust flakes crunching under your elbow as you shift. You tilt your head, listening. Not for the wind, not for wolves, but for mice. 'Cause in a medieval home, the bread isn't just yours. It's everyone with a nose and a nibbling instinct. Anyway, and bread is treasure. So you eye the ceiling beams, glance at the base of the cupboard, listen for the scurrying patter of little paws with big appetites. Bread needs guarding. At night, you wrap it in cloth and hang it high, maybe from a hook, maybe in a net from a beam, a little swinging pouch of calories and prayer. Because if you leave it out, the mice will come. If you bury it, it'll mold. If you hide it in the chimney nook, the smoke might harden it into something archaeologists will one day label ceramic adjacent. You finish the slice you've been working on and brush the crumbs into your palm habitually, reverently, nothing wasted. And then you remember trencher bread, those old, thick slabs used as edible plates, served under stews, under meats, under anything messy. They absorbed juices, melted sauces, and by the end of the meal, you either ate the trencher or fed it to the dogs, or, if you were pious, to the poor. Trencher bread wasn't fancy. It wasn't even fresh. The staler, the better, so it wouldn't fall apart, which means, basically, if you've ever eaten dinner off a slice of medieval bread, congratulations. You've dined off a medieval sponge. Historians still argue whether the poor actually received these trenchers regularly, or if that was just the nobles' favorite bedtime story to tell themselves. Either way, the image lingers, hunks of meat sliding across stone-hard rye, noble fingers smearing grease into dough, and some wide-eyed servant waiting quietly to inherit the leftovers. You eat, at least, don't eat off your bread. You eat your bread. But the memory of trenchers makes you glance at your thicker slices with new respect. Functional, durable, absorbent, like the napkin, bowl, and plate all rolled into one slightly damp bundle. Medieval innovation at its finest. You stand to stretch, joints creaking like they're older than you are. Maybe they are. That's what grinding flour and hauling firewood will do to a body. At the hearth, you prod the coals, still warm, maybe warm enough for a second baking a biscuit or two. A flat round of barley dough, something to stretch the flour another day. Because you're always stretching time, stretching dough, stretching meals between one market and the next. That's what bread is, in a way. The art of turning almost nothing into something. Water, flour, salt, air, four things. If you're lucky, and if you treat them right, they feed you. You sit back down, slice off one more piece, thinner this time. You've got to ration what's left. You chew slower, not because you're full, but because you want it to last. That's the thing about bread. It teaches you patience, and hunger, and how, sometimes, the simplest things, heat, grain. Time can be the hardest to hold on to. You chew, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the even softer sound of the loaf settling into itself, cooling, resting, ready for tomorrow. You glance at the remaining slices and think, maybe, just maybe, you'll have enough to share if the mice don't get it first. You wake up to the unmistakable sound of chewing, not your own, definitely not human. You sit up, eyes bleary, and tilt your head toward the corner cupboard. The faint scritching confirms it. They've found it. Somehow, despite the cloth wrapping, despite the high hook, Despite your whispered bedtime threats, the mice have made their move. You stumble across the room, still half wrapped in your sleep blanket, and lift the cloth pouch. A hole, tiny teeth marks, a crescent of crumb gone. You sigh, not because you're angry, okay. Maybe a little, but because you knew this was coming. Bread doesn't last long in a medieval cottage, and it's not always your fault. There's a reason old loaves were stored in clay jars, or hung from ceilings, or even buried in hay. You once heard a neighbor tried storing theirs inside an empty pot with a lid held down by a rock. Didn't work. The mice just waited. Historians still argue whether rodent damage or mold was the greater enemy of household bread. Mold may have been more deadly, sure, but mice are personal. They sneak in, nibble your labor, and somehow always leave the part you were going to eat next. You peer into the pouch. Most of the loaf is intact. Just one corner gnawed, a bit of crust stolen, some polite droppings left behind as a thank you note. You tear off the damaged bit, toss it into the fire, and mutter a few unprintable things under your breath. Then you inspect what's left. Still good, still heavy, still enough to last through the day, if you're careful. You tear off a chunk and chew slowly, keeping one eye on the rafters just in case the mice regroup. You've seen them watching you from the beams, little noses twitching, calculating crumb-to-risk ratios. You consider traps, then remember last winter when you caught one and left it in a jar outside. The neighbor kid gave it a name. You ended up letting it go. Bread ethics are complicated. You shake the pouch again, tighten the knot, and this time hang it from a different beam. Higher, out of reach. Probably as you eat. You remember old tales about village bakers cursing loaves that vanished in the night, blaming fairies or jealous neighbors or demons. One old woman claimed her bread kept walking away because it had unfinished business. She said her husband's spirit had been trapped in the final crust. No one believed her, but no one argued either, because in the dark, when your last loaf is shrinking and your stomach is louder than your fire, all theories are welcome. You add a splash of broth to your crust and chew again. Softer now. Steam rises from your cup. The bread soaks it up like a sponge that's seen some things. You glance at your flour sack. Low, not empty, but enough to make you nervous. Tomorrow you'll have to barter for more. Maybe trade a few eggs, or help mend that thatched roof everyone keeps ignoring. You think of the manner again of their bread, their mice-free cupboards, their choices, not just over how much bread they had, but what kind of bread. Fennel bread, almond bread, saffron buns, spice loaves baked into shaped swans, suns, coats of arms. You've seen drawings. Bread that didn't look like food, bread that was art, bread that was flexing. You take another bite of your sloped, slightly gray, resolutely unshaped, but it's real. It's not pretending. It never once tried to be a swan. You finish your crust, brush the crumbs into your palm, feed one to the cat, feed one to yourself. The day begins, and the bread, what's left of it, goes back in the pouch. A little tighter, a little higher, and this time, maybe with a whisper, not tonight. You furry little thieves. The road to the mill is muddy today, but then again, when is it not? You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and shift the sack of grain on your back. It's not much, just enough to last a few weeks, if rationed right. But you've timed it carefully. The miller is in a decent mood lately, which means fewer sighs, fewer suspicious glares, and, if you're lucky, flour that doesn't include half a beetle population. The path winds through damp trees, the morning mist clinging to your boots. Each step sinks slightly, squelching in that way that says, yep, you'll be cleaning this mess off your floor tonight. The mill comes into view, tired stone walls, mossy shingles, and a crooked little water wheel that only turns if the stream feels like cooperating. You knock on the frame, step inside, and brace yourself. The air smells like wet wood and old grain. The grinding wheel rumbles in the background, shaking the floor with every pass. A fine cloud of flour dust hangs in the air, settling on everything: your hair, your sleeves, your eyelashes. Somehow, you find the miller hunched over a ledger. He doesn't look up. You set the sack down quietly and wait. Eventually, he mutters something about ratios, pulls out a scoop, and starts measuring. Now comes the waiting, because the grinding grain isn't fast. It's rhythmic, like a sleepy drum. The stones turn slowly, chewing the kernels into powder with a crunch that feels prehistoric. And you stand there, watching it happen. thinking about all the things you'll do with flour bread. Obviously, maybe a bit for gruel, a handful to trade for eggs if the chickens stop being moody. Historians still argue whether medieval milling was as inefficient as it seems, or if it was simply incredibly deliberate. Some scholars claim the slowness preserved grain integrity. Others say it was a byproduct of poor engineering and underfunded infrastructure. Either way, it's slow. You lean against the doorframe and watch dust sparkle in the light. The wheel creaks, the grain disappears, the flour collects, you blink, and imagine you're rich. Rich enough for a private oven, a private mill, bread every day soft enough to tear with your thumb. You imagine slicing a loaf with no grit inside, no worries of sand or splinters from unwashed grinding stones. Just pure, white flour, fluffy, silent. Trustworthy, your bread would be delicate. Your crust, optional. You'd name your loaves, probably back in reality. The miller hands you your sack, not generous, but not short. You nod your thanks, sling it over your shoulder, and start the long walk home. Each step squishes, your boots already heavier than you'd like. But the thought of fresh flour eases the burden a little. Back in your kitchen, you dust off the table, shake out the cloth, and pour a small pile of the new flour into your palm. Still coarse, still gray, still speckled with something you hope is just bran. But it's yours. You mix it with water, salt, starter. The dough forms stiffer than you remember, but not unwilling. You begin to knead, palms pressing, forearms straining, heart beating in time with each fold. This is where bread begins, and where patience returns. You smile, just a little, because no matter how hard the crust gets, no matter how many mice nibble the corners, and no matter how many times you pretend you're baking for a king when you're really baking for the cat and yourself, the bread keeps happening. And that, somehow, is enough. The dough rests now, curled under a damp cloth like a sleeping pet. You've kneaded it well, let it breathe, warmed it beside the hearth, and whispered every half prayer you know, because now comes the waiting again. But this time, you're prepared. You pull up a stool and set your elbows on the table. The dough sits before you in its bowl, swelling slowly, a dome of promise. You watch it like a parent watches a restless child ready to intervene, ready to defend, but mostly just watching. This part is quiet. You exhale. The fire flickers low behind you, throwing a soft red glow across the floorboards. Outside, someone's chopping wood. The rhythm is slow, deliberate, almost meditative. You try to match it in your mind. Thump, thump, pause, thump. Meanwhile, the dough rises. Barely. You squint. Is it bigger? Is that a bubble? Or are you imagining things again? Historians still argue whether rise time was measured by instinct, sun angles, or sheer superstition. Some say bakers used to press a thumb into the dough and chant a verse to judge its mood. Others relied on their noses. You just wait. You poke it now and then. You sniff. You hope. And as the dough expands, so do the memories. You think back to the bread your grandmother used to make. Her hands like cracked leather, always smelling of smoke and onions. She'd slap the dough with affection and mutter about spirits who spoiled loaves left alone too long. She swore by garlic baked into the crust it kept the rot away, she said, or the devil's. Depending on the day, one time, she buried a loaf in the garden as an offering. The dog dug it up, dragged it back into the house, and the floorboard smelled like garlic and soil for weeks. You both ate it anyway. You smile at the memory. The dough, still rising. You get up, stretch, crack your back like a crust under a blade. Then you start preparing the next step. The peel, the dusting flour, a smear of grease for the baking stone, a splash of water for the crust's final crunch. These rituals matter, even if they don't help the loaf rise faster. They feel like they do. You peek again. Yes, definitely taller. You shape it gently, tuck the sides under, round it out, make it tidy. This part is almost soothing. The dough is warm now, friendly in your hands. No longer fighting. It's alive, and it knows. You press your favorite mark into the top. Not a cross today, just a circle. Simply, protective, like sealing a letter no one else will read. You let it rest again, and you breathe. Sometimes, you wonder what it would be like to own a bread stamp, one of those brass or bone tools the fancy folk use to press patterns into their loaves. Swirls, griffins, family crests. You once saw a loaf shaped like a fish. You almost cried, but your hands are stamp enough. Your mark is your own. You carry the loaf to the oven, careful not to jostle it. The heat pulses gently, like it's waiting for you. The fire's settled now. The stones are warm and steady. This is it. You slide the loaf in. It lands with a soft shh on the stone, almost a sigh. You shut the door and sit back. Now the real magic begins, and the house starts to smell like it matters again. That quiet mix of smoke, grain, and the faint sweetness of heat. It fills the corners, seeps into your sleeves, hangs in your hair. Even the cat perks up, padding over to sit beside the hearth, tail curled, eyes half lidded like it baked the loaf itself. You rest your chin on your palm and watch the flames dance. This is peace. Not perfect peace, not rich. Nobly, silk-cloaked peace, but your kind. And as the loaf rises in the fire's embrace, you allow yourself to believe maybe this one will be your best yet. Maybe the crust will yield. Maybe the crumb will be soft. Maybe it won't chip a single tooth. You'll know soon enough. But for now, you wait. You don't touch the oven right away. You know better than that. 'Cause bread, like most living things, doesn't like being rushed. So you sit near the hearth, keeping one eye on the flames and the other on the smoke, which curls lazily upward just the way it should. No frantic hissing, no ominous clouds. The loaf is baking, right? You allow yourself a rare moment of smugness. Just a little. The cat seems to approve. Still, you keep your ear tuned for the signs. The crust hardening with a faint crackle. The occasional pop as a hidden air pocket shifts deep within the dough. And, most importantly, the smell. It's here now. That perfect, toasted, slightly nutty scent that whispers, this bread might actually be worth it. You smile and inhale deeply, the aroma settling into your chest like a lullaby. You remember a time when the smell of baking bread meant something entirely different. Feast days, harvest festivals, weddings, even executions. Strangely enough, they always seemed to bake extra loaves on those days. Something about needing to feed the crowd or the condemned. Historians still argue whether the connection between bread and public rituals was spiritual, symbolic, or simply practical. Probably all three. Bread was easy to share, easy to bless, easy to break. You check the oven, not by opening it, never open too early, but by listening closely, then quickly cracking the door for a heartbeat, just enough. The loaf has browned, not burned, not pale, a good, even tan. Like it spent a healthy afternoon sunbathing on a very hot rock. You ease the door open wider, reach for the paddle, and slide the loaf out. It's heavier than before. Denser, firmer, done. You knock the bottom, a dull thud. Perfect. You place it gently on a wooden board, and for a moment, just look at it. This loaf is nothing special. No spices, no added seeds or swirl of cheese, no decorative braiding or carved crust. Just a round, warm, stubborn wheel of survival. It's beautiful. You cover it with a cloth and let it rest. If you cut too soon, it'll tear apart from the steam. You've learned that lesson too many times. You pour a little water into a cup, swish it, sippy, and think about all the other loaves you've made. The soggy ones. The ones that cracked wide open like a scream. The one that collapsed in on itself like it was ashamed to be born. And the one you accidentally sat on. This one is good. You gently press a finger into the crust. It yields just slightly, then holds. You lean in and listen. Yes, listen, because sometimes if you're quiet enough, you can hear the crust cooling, a soft tick, 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 like tiny steps on stone. You take out your knife and slice. The sound is music. The inside, not perfect. A few holes, a little dense toward the bottom, but nothing that'll break a tooth or bruise your pride. You break off a piece, smear a bit of lentil paste on it, and chew slowly. It's chewy, nutty, a little tang from the fermentation. It tastes like time, like patience, like survival. You wrap the loaf back up. You've had enough for now. The rest will wait. That's the whole point. Bread is a promise that tomorrow, you'll have something. It may not be much. It may not be soft. It may not be pretty, but it will be enough. You lean back, close your eyes, and let the loaf settle beside you on the table, radiating warmth, like a small sun made of grain and fire. Tomorrow, it will be tougher. The next day, even more. But tonight, It is perfect. By morning, the loaf is different. Harder, less forgiving, a little shriveled around the edges, like it aged 10 years overnight. You tap it and the sound echoes a little too much. You sigh, knowing exactly what this means. It's moved into its next phase, no longer soft enough to slice for comfort, but not yet stale enough for soup. The awkward middle, you weigh your options. Toasting is possible, if you can keep the fire steady. Soaking it in ale or milk might work too, though it risks turning the whole thing into a wet sponge with the texture of regret. Then there's always scraping off the crust and reworking the interior into a mash. But that feels like admitting defeat. You go with toasting. You split the loaf in half and wedge it onto a flat stone beside the fire. No fancy racks. No neat wires, just heat and a well-placed stick to keep it from falling into the ashes. It toasts slowly, crackles faintly. The smell is different this time. Not baking, but deepening. A little smoky, a little sharp, almost caramelized. It smells like memory, like something that once was soft and kind, now becoming something else entirely. Sharp, strong, useful. This is how old bread earns its second life. You scrape the bottom with a knife, careful to catch the blackened bits before they take over. Then you spread what you have, some mashed turnips with salt, maybe a scrape of old fat or leftover stew. It's not elegant, but it's breakfast, and honestly, not bad. You chew and think. Bread isn't just food. It's history. It's habit. It's ritual. It's what people fought over, prayed for, taxed, traded, and sometimes stole. There were bread riots in towns where the price climbed too high. Edicts were passed demanding loaves of a certain weight and purity. Bakers caught cheating the flour ratio were fined or worse, pilloried with their own underweight buns hanging around their necks like shameful medals. Historians still argue whether those stories were exaggerated to scare apprentices, or if municipal bread enforcement was genuinely that intense. Either way, you can't help imagining a baker standing in a square, humiliated by a string of mini loaves bouncing against his chest as people laughed. Bread was serious business. You scrape another bite off your toasted half and chase it with a sip of watered cider. The crust is now your favorite part, crackling and smoky, holding its own against the weak turnip mash. It's not indulgent, but it is satisfying, which is more than most days ask for. The other half of the loaf, you decide, will be for lunch or dinner or tomorrow or whenever you need it most. Because old bread keeps, it adapts like you, and if you're clever, really clever, you might even cube what's left. Dry it fully and toss it into a pot later this week with onions and broth. Poor man's pottage. It's not glamorous, but it's hearty, filling. You've heard of bread being used to bind sausages, to thicken blood pudding, even as stuffing for fish. The possibilities multiply, the harder the loaf becomes. You glance at what's left on your board, 3 dry wedges, a scatter of crumbs, and your faithful knife. Tomorrow. Maybe you'll grind the stale bits down, mix them with flour and lard, and try for fried bread cakes. Maybe you'll barter one for an egg. Maybe you'll just eat them cold, dipped in cider, while sitting on your doorstep watching the sky do its usual blue to gray shuffle. Because bread, even at its most stubborn, is dependable. It may hurt your teeth. It may demand effort, but it never leaves you hungry if you're willing to be a little patient, a little creative, and just the tiniest bit brave. You take one last bite and smile through the crunch. This loaf has outlived its softness, but not its usefulness. The crust breaks beneath your teeth like dry bark, but this time, you're ready for it. You chew slowly, methodically, letting each bite soften before the next. The last wedge of bread sits in your palm lighter now, dried through, its color a deep golden brown edged with ash smudge gray. You run your thumb along the bottom. It's hard as pottery. No, not bread anymore. Now it's rusk. You didn't bake it into that deliberately. Of course, it just happened. Like everything in your kitchen, slowly, unevenly, with the quiet force of time. You soak it briefly in broth left over from last night. It hisses faintly as the steam hits it, a whisper from another life. The edges relax. The middle doesn't, not quite, but it's enough. You chew, and with every slow bite, the story of the loaf unfolds again. Not the fantasy of soft manchette or braided spice bread, not the lacy elegance of noble fare, but the ordinary miracle of taking 4 humble things: grain, water, salt, fire, and making something that clings to life a little longer than you do. And here's the strange thing about medieval bread. It was never just about taste. It was about trust. You trusted that even if the grain was coarse, the oven moody, the crust defiant, the loaf would be there when you woke up. You trusted it to hold your stew, to stretch your fast days, to quiet your hunger just enough to sleep. Historians still argue whether peasants in the Middle Ages felt pride in their bread or simply resignation. The truth is, they probably didn't have time to reflect on it either way. They just kept baking, kept chewing, kept feeding themselves and others with whatever they could coax from the earth and the embers. You break off another corner. This one snaps. You toss the broken tip to the cat, who bats it once before deciding even her teeth have limits. Fair. You smile anyway. You'll grind the last pieces tomorrow. Add a bit of bean flour. Maybe roll it into something vaguely spherical, flatbreadish. You'll call it new, because that's what bread demands. Invention, transformation, patience, again and again and again. The wind picks up outside, sliding under the door and curling around your ankles. You nudge the coals, wrapping a cloth tighter around your shoulders. The loaf is gone now. Only crumbs remain. You gather them carefully, brushing them into your hand like treasure, and drop them into the broth pot. Waste nothing, and just like that, the life of your bread is over. But it will rise again. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon you'll haul your sack of flour to the bowl again. Add water. Stir the slurry with the same cracked spoon. Knead it with the same calloused palms. Press in your quiet mark. And hope, because bread doesn't need to be beautiful. It just needs to be there. And when it is, you'll chew, you'll sigh, you'll curse the crust and love it anyway. And maybe, just maybe, you'll sleep a little easier. Now, let everything slow. Let your jaw rest. Let your hands uncurl from the imagined dough and ease into the quiet hum of your own breath. The loaf is finished. The crumbs are gathered. The fire is low and flickering, casting a warm golden rhythm across the walls. You're full not from flavor, but from the simple comfort of enough. Just enough to stretch to morning. Just enough to trust. The wind outside has softened, too, slipping through thatch and shutter with less bite now. The mice have gone still. Even the cat has curled into a tight loaf of her own, tail tucked, ears relaxed, dreaming of crumb chasing and warm sun patches. You lie back slowly, a blanket around your shoulders, a fading warmth in your chest. Bread, for all its toughness, for all its jaw-testing stubbornness, gave you the rhythm of kneading, the scent of baking, the hush of shared hunger, the deep quiet of having survived one more meal, one more day. You feel the weight of it settle not in your stomach, but somewhere deeper, like an anchor, like reassurance. And in that stillness, you finally sigh, a real one, long, gentle. Content, you've done enough. You are enough. Let the crust rest. Let the fire fade. Let the silence rise like soft dough under cloth and drift gently toward sleep. Hey guys, tonight we step into a wooden tub, steam curling around your nose. Your foot hovering over warm water that smells faintly of herbs and something else. Maybe mildew, maybe despair. But you're here, teetering on the edge of the one thing medieval people feared more than taxes. Plague, or running out of ale. A bath. You inch closer, fingers grazing the water's surface. It's warm, suspiciously warm, and you pause, because you know what they say, that heat opens the pores, that the devil can sneak in that way. That disease lives in moist places, and suddenly, getting clean feels like inviting disaster. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your foot finally dips in. The warmth climbs up your ankle like a secret. A shiver runs along your spine. You ease down into the water, grimacing as it laps over your legs and hugs your hips. The tub creaks. The water sloshes. Your elbows rest against the wood. And for a brief moment, it's not terrible. But you're tense, because you've heard the stories. Baths are for the foolish, or the rich, or the dead. People used to bathe more often. You've been told. Back in the early medieval period, bathhouses were part of the public life. Some towns had them near markets or monasteries. Even small villages might share a communal tub behind the tavern. Hot water, herbal infusions, cheerful gossip, a warm soak after a long day. So what happened? Well, fear happened. By the late Middle Ages, bathhouses started getting a reputation, not just for being, let's say, socially adventurous places, we'll get there, but for making people sick. Bathing became associated with vulnerability. The medical theories of the time said open pores were danger zones. Let too much hot water touch your skin, and you invited disease, imbalance, even death. You glance around the room now. Paranoid. Steam clings to the rafters, water beads on your arms. You imagine your pores swinging open like medieval trapdoors, just begging for a stray miasma to wander in. You try to relax, but you can't stop thinking about your humors. Do you even have all four? Is your black bile supposed to fizz like that? And there's that one case, you remember the nobleman who bathed before a banquet and dropped dead before dessert. They said the bath made him too soft, too exposed. He was ripe for plague. Historians still argue whether this shift in bathing habits was driven more by medical beliefs, religious conservatism, or sheer logistical messiness. Likely, it was all three. Getting hot water required effort. Keeping it clean, impossible. Sharing it with your entire family, neighbors, and a goat. A hygiene paradox. You reach for a cloth, dip it in the water, and rub your arms gently. It feels nice, but also like you're washing away layers of protection. You wince when your fingers graze your neck. Did something bite you? Or was that just a draft? You remember that some people used to bathe in full linen shifts to protect modesty and absorb sin. The fabric clung to their skin, cold and cloying, but it made them feel less naked, less exposed to spirits. You almost wish you had one now. You glance at the water. It's already murky. You've only been in here 5 minutes, and the water looks like it's auditioning to be medieval stew. Bits of straw from your hair, soot from the fire, maybe a fleck of bread from your last meal. How did that even get in here? And now you're supposed to feel clean. You exhale through your nose and sink a little deeper. Let the heat numb your limbs. Let the past creep closer. You've begun your descent into a world where bathing wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. And the water you sit in now, it's only the beginning. You lean back in the tub, watching the steam rise like the ghost of a better idea. The warmth is pleasant, but your mind keeps circling a single thought. Who else used this water? And not in a cute, shared with friends kind of way. More in the multiple strangers with questionable rashes and maybe a goat kind of way. Welcome to the public bathhouse. You imagine yourself stepping into one now, a dim, low-ceiling building that smells like damp wood, old sweat, and the herbal equivalent of wishful thinking. The floors are slick, the benches sticky, and the air is thick with conversation, coughs, and something fungal. But this was once normal. In the earlier centuries of medieval Europe, especially in places like the Holy Roman Empire, France, and even parts of England, bathhouses were not only accepted, but popular. People would gather to scrub, soak, flirt, and occasionally strike business deals while elbow deep in shared water. Tubs were lined up like pews in a chapel of soapless redemption. A wood-fired stove boiled the water, which was then hauled by the bucketful into the bathing room. You'd strip down modesty optional, climb into your tub, or sit on a bench, and stew alongside everyone else like awkward vegetables in a communal soup. And it really was a soup. Because here's the problem. Nobody changed the water between clients. So if you were bath number 4 that day, you were soaking in the leftover skin flakes, sweat oils, and unidentifiable floaties from bathers 1 through 3. Delightful. Doctors of the time were beginning to get nervous. They noticed something. Whenever a plague or fever broke out, people who visited bathhouses seemed to get sick faster. Theories formed. Heat opened the pores. Water carried invisible poisons. Bathhouses weren't cleansing, they were contaminating. Historians still argue whether these links were causal or just unlucky timing. Maybe bathhouses were vectors, or maybe people just liked to blame something wet and weird when things went wrong. Regardless, fear spread faster than the next bucket of water. Regulations came down. Some cities banned bathhouses entirely. Others limited their hours or demanded separate spaces for men and women. Some required that bathers bring their own towels, which, let's be honest, is probably something that should have been implemented much earlier, but people kept going, because in many cases, public baths were the only option. Most homes didn't have the space or means to heat a full tub. A bathhouse was your best shot at warmth, cleanliness, or even social life. Sure, you might leave with ringworm, but you'd also catch up on gossip and maybe enjoy a boiled egg afterward. Yes, boiled eggs were a bathhouse snack. Because why not combine steaming flesh with steaming food? You shift in your own tub, now suddenly more aware of the water temperature. Is it cooling? Is that draft from the window? Or something creeping in? You remember how some bathhouses tried to fix the plague problem by mixing herbs into the water. Things like sage, rosemary, and lavender were believed to purify both body and air. You imagine someone standing over you right now, crumbling thyme into your bath like a seasoning blend. You sniff the air. No thyme, just the faint scent of damp cloth and your own indecision. Still, you stay in the water because, if nothing else, it's warmer than the floor. You close your eyes and try to imagine a better bathhouse. Maybe one with changing water. Maybe one where the benches don't stick. Maybe one where the local doctor doesn't hover outside the door like a grim reaper holding a thermometer carved from bone. You soak, still tense, still uncertain. Because even now, centuries later, some of that bathhouse anxiety lingers in your bones. That worry that maybe getting too clean might somehow make you vulnerable. That the water is carrying more than it should. That you're not soaking alone. You open your eyes, still alone. But you're beginning to understand why they feared this. The water is starting to cool. It clings to your skin like a memory you're trying to forget something once warm. Now teetering toward the uncomfortable. You shift, legs crossing, and your foot brushes something soft near the bottom, a clump of lint, a ghost of medieval hygiene. You decide not to investigate. Instead, you reach for soap, or what you think is soap. It's a rough, waxy lump, more beige than white, and it smells vaguely of charcoal, bacon fat, and crushed leaves. You bring it to your nose. Yep, definitely not lavender. Wegby to medieval cleansing. You scrub it between your palms and frown. No lather. No soothing bubbles, just a weird paste and a mild sense of betrayal. The ingredients, probably ash, tallow, and maybe a handful of lye if you're lucky, or unlucky. Soap wasn't always a household item. In fact, for many medieval folks, it was more rumor than reality. Peasants often made their own, if at all, using leftover fat from animals and ashes scooped from the hearth. The result was harsh, drying, and smelled like an undercooked breakfast. Richer folk had access to imported luxury bars, olive oil soap from Castile, scented blocks from Islamic traders, smooth, fragrant, and expensive. Those soaps were locked away like treasure. You get the homemade brick. Possibly last year's. Historians still argue whether people truly used soap for bathing or just for laundry. There's solid evidence that clothing was scrubbed with it, but whether it regularly touched skin is less certain. Most personal cleansing relied on cloths, water, and scraping not suds. You rub the soap against your shoulder. It squeaks. It literally squeaks. You raise an eyebrow and mentally downgrade your expectations. You rinse. Sort of. The water's murky now. The kind of color that makes you wonder if someone dropped in a turnip. There's a film on your arm that doesn't feel like cleanliness. More like a second skin. You imagine a medieval bather scrubbing harder, assuming the roughness means it's working. Maybe it does, or maybe that's just their skin giving up. There's a basin nearby. You scoop some fresh water over yourself, a primitive rinse cycle. It hits your back with a jolt. Cold, unforgiving, real, and that's the thing, most baths weren't actually hot. Firewood was scarce, and heating that much water took time and labor. So while the idea of a steaming soak is romantic, most people got tepid dunkings or chilled splashdowns, just enough to make you doubt the whole enterprise. You glance at the soap again. It's sitting on a wooden tray, looking proud of itself. You resist the urge to throw it out the window. Instead, you think about the fact that this little bar might have taken days to make, rendering the fat, sifting ashes, boiling the mixture over a smoky fire, pouring it into molds, letting it cure for weeks. That's a lot of work for something that smells like regret. But maybe that's the point. Bathing wasn't meant to be indulgent. It was effort. It was work. It was a gamble every time. Would you feel cleaner or just colder, wetter, and vaguely cursed? You stand now. Carefully, the wood of the tub creaking under your shifting weight. You reach for a cloth to dry off rough linen. Of course, stiff from the last washing and probably embedded with tiny bits of soap from the communal laundry pot. You rub it across your arms, legs, neck, not a soft hotel towel. More like being gently scolded by a potato sack. Still, the drying process matters. It was part of the ritual. You had to close the pores, trap the warmth, ward off the evil chills that crept in after exposure. You wrap the cloth around your shoulders and sit on the stool by the fire. The tub behind you sloshes once, as if sighing. Bath, complete. Soap, questionable. Cleanliness, debatable. But here you are, drying in the fire's glow, contemplating the bar of soap on the tray like it just dared you to try again tomorrow. You probably won't. You sit by the fire, rubbing warmth back into your arms, still damp from that confusing bath. The tub behind you gurgles once more, perhaps in judgment. You don't turn around. You've survived. And for now, that's enough. But not everyone thinks so. 'Cause in some corners of your world, even sitting near that tub would have been scandalous. Welcome to the great moral panic of the bath. You pull the cloth tighter around your shoulders as if it might shield you from imaginary sermons. Because if medieval people feared bathing for medical reasons, they really feared it for moral ones. Baths weren't just risky, they were downright suspicious. Imagine a bathhouse, candlelit, steam clinging to every surface, and bodies real. Human bodies moving and lounging and scrubbing in semi-public. For some church leaders and social reformers, that was basically a sin stew with extra bubbles. Historians still argue whether the moral backlash was truly about piety or more about control over bodies, behavior, and who got to define clean. Either way, the message was clear. Too much bathing was vanity, or lust, or pride, or all of them rolled into one slippery slope. You imagine a preacher with damp armpits, yelling at townsfolk about modesty while pointedly not making eye contact with the bathhouse across the square, because the bathhouse had become complicated. It wasn't just a place to scrub off the day's dirt. It was where people flirted, whispered, maybe even made side deals under the misty cover of eucalyptus steam. So, naturally, the line between bathing and something else began to blur. Regulations sprang up. Bathhouses were sometimes shuttered or relocated to less visible parts of towns. In extreme cases, laws lumped them in with brothels. Some towns even banned mixed bathing entirely, though compliance, shall we say, varied. You shift on the stool and imagine trying to bathe in a linen shift, a soaking wet garment clinging to your skin, while you try not to offend anyone's sense of spiritual decency. You'd be cleaner, sure, but you'd also be shivering and vaguely guilty. Ironically, some church texts also praise bathing as a way to honor the body a temple. After all, still needed dusting. Saints were known to immerse themselves as part of purification rituals. Pilgrims sometimes washed before entering sacred spaces. So the contradiction lingered. Is the bath holy or sinful? Maybe both. In some regions, religious leaders even started offering baptism-style bathing, where the physical act of washing was fused with spiritual renewal. But these events were rare, and certainly didn't involve communal tubs full of suspicious floaties. Back in your corner of history, though, all this debate leaves you with one certainty. Bathing is risky not just for your health, but for your reputation. Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but only if you don't look like you're enjoying it too much. You look down at your hands, now dry, slightly wrinkled, and smelling faintly of that mystery soap. Would your neighbors suspect you of indulgence, of vanity, of being a little too interested in your own well-being? You shrug, let them talk. 'Cause at least for tonight, you feel better. You're not sure if it's cleaner, exactly, but warmer, and that's something. You lean back, watching the fire flicker and dance across the wet rim of the tub. Tomorrow, you might face suspicion, sarcasm, or even another trip to the confession booth of communal hygiene. But for now, you made it through the moral minefield of medieval bathing. Mostly dry, mostly intact, mostly innocent. The cloth around your shoulders is nearly dry now, but your thoughts are still damp with unease. That bath felt good, sort of, but now your limbs ache. Your nose is sniffling, and a tiny voice in the back of your head whispers, "The doctor warned you." 'Cause if anyone hated baths more than medieval moralists, it was your neighborhood physician. You picture him now, long robe, a hat too large for his head, a sour expression that could curdle goat's milk. He wraps his cane once on your floor, peers over your modest wash tub, and sighs like he's already mourning your soul. Why? Because the medical consensus in many periods of medieval and early modern Europe was that baths could weaken you. Seriously, the dominant medical model at the time, humoral theory, argued that your body was made up of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A delicate balance among them kept you healthy. Too much heat, moisture, or exposure to outside air could upset this balance. And what's a bath? A soupy wet invitation to imbalance. Your pores, those tiny invisible gates of bodily defense, were said to open during a warm bath. That made you vulnerable to bad airs, or miasmas the evil, invisible particles that supposedly cause disease. According to your doctor, the second you stepped out of a steamy bathhouse, a cold draft could slither through your open pores like a snake down a chimney. Historians still argue whether physicians actually believed this, or if it was just an easy excuse for why everyone was constantly coughing in candlelight. But it shaped public health policies for centuries. You imagine asking your doctor about washing your feet. He'd probably say, only with warm wine and a whispered prayer. People did that, by the way. Especially for infants or the elderly. They'd soak cloths in warmed wine, wring them out, and wipe the body gently. This dry bath avoided the dangers of full immersion and conveniently doubled as a wine-based excuse to avoid chores. You glance at your now cooling tub and wonder, could I have just used wine? No, of course not. You're not rich. And also, that wine is for drinking later. Thank you very much. Still, dry bathing remained a preferred method well into the Renaissance. Wiping the body with scented cloths or vinegar-soaked linen was considered far safer than dunking yourself in a vat of potential plague water. You sniff your shoulder. No scent of rosemary. No violet tinctures. Just you. There's something oddly reassuring about it. And oddly itchy. That could be the rough cloth, though, or maybe the soap, or possibly the revenge of your now confused humors. You're not a doctor. You're just a recently bathed human wondering if cleanliness is worth the internal chaos. You remember hearing a tale of a noblewoman who bathed only once a month and still outlived her entire household. Coincidence, or proof that dirt protects. You smirk, then sneeze. The dreaded post-bath sniffle. Exactly what your doctor warned about. You can practically hear his voice. You've let in the cold. You've weakened the liver. Expect melancholy by dawn. You roll your eyes. Still, you wrap yourself a little tighter. Because even if the bath was a gamble, it's over now. The water is still. The fire's low. And you're as clean as you're going to get. You reach for the mug on your stool. It's filled with weak ale, warm, flat, and probably safer than water. You sip slowly. A post-bath ritual of your own. Maybe you'll feel better by morning. Maybe your phlegm will realign with your bile. Maybe your doctor will walk past your door and not gasp at the scent of mild soap. But probably not. You sip the ale again, lukewarm, barely fizzy, and somehow both sour and sweet. It's not great, but it's better than the water you just bathed in. That counts as a win. And speaking of not bathing, let's talk about your other hygiene solution, perfume. Because when you can't or won't scrub yourself clean with water, you reach for the next best thing. Masking the smell. You shuffle toward your small table, where a little cloth bundle sits waiting. Inside, a handful of dried rose petals, a crusty pot of musk paste, and a vinegar rag that hasn't been moist in weeks. Still, you hold it to your nose. Inhale the ghost of sharp herbs and old linen, and feel almost fancy. This is the medieval version of deodorant. It doesn't kill odor, it just competes with it. Hard. For wealthier folks, perfume became an entire category of hygiene. They dabbed themselves with rose water, frankincense oil, or orange blossom distillations, scented gloves, scented pouches in their sleeves, even perfume combs. Every item on your person could and maybe should smell better than your body did. You, on the other hand, are working with the basics. A sprig of dried mint tucked into your collar, a smear of clove paste behind your ear, and the occasional luxury of lavender vinegar if you haven't drunk it first as a health tonic. Historians still argue whether perfume was meant primarily for hygiene or just courtly display. Some say it was a status symbol, a way to show refinement. Others point to recipe books that treat perfumed oils as cleansers, meant to ward off illness through scent. But one thing is certain, people stank, and everyone knew it. So scent layering was a daily strategy. You press the vinegar cloth against your chest and wince. Cold. Sharp. But it cuts through the post-bath haze like a tiny herbal slap. This was how most people felt clean. Not through removal of dirt, but by overpowering it. You think back to the bath, the soapy brick, the squeaky scrub, the ghost of moral panic hovering over your tub like steam. And now this splashing vinegar water on your pulse points and praying no one gets too close. Even nobles, who had more access to bathing in scented oils, often preferred these dry methods. They'd wrap themselves in layers of linen shirt after chemise after petticoat, not just for modesty, but because it absorbed sweat. Then they'd rotate garments, beating them clean with herbs and sun. Laundry, in some cases, was more common than bathing. You reach for a linen square and pat your face. Dry, almost clean, maybe a little vinegary, still better than yesterday. You remember hearing about pomander's small metal balls, filled with scented herbs or resins, worn around the neck or clipped to a belt. They jingled slightly when you walked, which made them halfway between hygiene item and fashion flex. You imagine yourself walking into a medieval market, your pomander clinking, your musk paste melting slightly in the sun, your vinegar rag tucked into your sleeve like a damp secret. Not exactly glamorous, but effective, at least effective enough to make people think you were clean. You stare at the cloth in your hands. It's damp now, tinged with brown around the edges. You flip it, pat under your arms, and feel a bizarre sense of satisfaction. Not the clean of a modern shower, more like the clean of not being the worst smelling person in the room. A low bar, but one worth clearing. You lean back again. The fire has shrunk to a warm glow, casting long shadows across the walls. You're no longer dripping, just scented, layered in vinegar, herbs, and the faint smugness of having cleaned yourself without inviting death. Not bad for a bath avoider. You take another sip of ale, nose twitching slightly at the strange cocktail of smells rising from your own skin. Vinegar, smoke, and something earthy, maybe the mint, maybe just time. And you sigh. Because for now, you're clean enough. The cloth hangs limply now, vinegar scent fading into something more like pickled memory. You set it aside. Stretch your legs toward the fire and feel the weight of the day settle over you. Not the grime, because you've handled that. Thank you very much, but the mental dust kicked up by the effort of staying hygienic without angering God, doctors, or the smell sensitive. And now, a thought creeps in. What if you're supposed to be dirty? Not in a you forgot to bathe way, more in a spiritual badge of honor way, because you've heard whisper stories of people who avoided bathing, not just out of fear or laziness, but out of genuine, heartfelt devotion. Saints, monks, anchorites in their stone cells, wrapped in filth and scripture, who believed cleanliness of the soul mattered far more than the body. You wrap your arms around your knees. Imagine sitting in a drafty monastery, your robe stiff with months' years of wear, your hair knotted like holy rope. You haven't bathed in a decade, but your heart is pure, or at least, that's the idea. It wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Some saints were canonized in part because of their dedication to staying as physically untouched as possible. Water, they believed, was a temptation, a luxury. To avoid it was a sign of discipline, self-denial, and spiritual strength. Historians still argue whether this ideal was widespread or more of an elite monastic quirk. In many hagiographies, those sacred biographies' saints are described as being surrounded by miraculous fragrance, even while covered in visible grime. Their holiness overpowered their stink. You glance down at your own feet, smudged and still damp around the toes. No miraculous fragrance here, but you're trying. You remember the story of Saint Sylvia, mother of Pope Gregory the Great. She bathed once a week. Once, and that was considered generous. Meanwhile, other figures like Saint Cuthbert reportedly avoided water at all costs, unless it was icy seawater used to stand and pray all night, while eels tickled his ankles. A normal Wednesday. And then there's the revered female anchorite who lived sealed in a stone cell attached to a church. She didn't bathe. She didn't change clothes. People passed food through a slot in the wall and occasionally sought her advice on spiritual matters, probably from a respectful distance. You try to imagine that life, the stillness, the silence, the smell. There's something poetic about it and something profoundly itchy. You scratch your arm and frown. Is cleanliness actually ungodly? Or did some people just get really good at spiritual spin? You shift again, trying to find a more comfortable spot on the stool. Your tunic sticks slightly where it dried unevenly. Maybe being holy also means developing a high tolerance for fabric abrasion. Still, The idea lingers to be dirty on purpose, to reject the bath not out of fear, but faith. Not all societies shared this mindset. Of course, ancient Romans practically invented spa culture. Islamic traditions often emphasize cleanliness as part of spiritual practice. Japanese onsens were and still are meditative rituals, but in certain corners of medieval Europe, filth became a kind of purity. A paradox, you're still trying to scrub off your thoughts. You poke at the fire with a stick, watching sparks leap upward. You imagine the saints watching you from some higher realm, shaking their heads gently, whispering, "We didn't need soap." You whisper back, "You didn't have fleas." Then pause, because they probably did. The fire crackles softly now, its light flickering across the room like a quiet thought that can't decide whether to stay or sleep. You lean into the warmth, elbow on your knee, cheek against your fist, and wonder if the saints didn't bathe, and the nobles barely bothered. Who actually kept the world from turning into a stink fest? The answer, barbers. Yes, barbers. You blink slowly, remembering the name from old tavern signs. Barber surgeon. A profession that sounds like it should come with a liability waiver and at least one stain-resistant apron. You stretch and imagine stepping into their shop, half haircut haven, half minor medical theater. You might go in for a shave and come out bandaged, bleed, and possibly one mole lighter. Because in the absence of regular doctors or when you couldn't afford one, the barber stepped in. Not just to trim your hair or beard, but to clean wounds, pull teeth, lance boils, or give you a good cupping, which is either an ancient therapy or a deeply personal crisis, depending on how squeamish you are. Historians still argue whether barber surgeons were true medical professionals or just guys with sharp things. But in practice, they were essential, especially when it came to public hygiene. You imagine sitting in that wobbly chair, your head tilted, your throat exposed. A towel soaked in herbal water is wrapped around your jaw. A blade glides down your cheek. Steam rises from a basin beneath you, mingling with the scent of rosemary and iron. It's terrifying, and somehow soothing, because even if it's not exactly a bath, a visit to the barber was a ritual of partial cleanliness. A face scrub here, a scalp rinse there, enough to keep appearances up, if not actual germs down. The tools, brutal by modern standards. Razors the size of cheese knives, tweezers forged during a thunderstorm, and of course, the ubiquitous leech jar, because why not remove a little blood while you're freshening up? You smile at the absurdity of it all, especially since barber surgeons were often stationed in the same areas as bathhouses. People would go in for a trim and maybe end up soaking their feet, steaming their faces, or casually having a toenail removed. It was less of a salon day and more of a medieval car wash for humans with extra bleeding. You wiggle your fingers as if counting how many digits you'd like to keep today. Most barbers kept a red and white pole outside the now iconic barber pole. The red symbolized blood. The white was for the bandages. And the pole itself represented the stick you held onto during a bloodletting session so you wouldn't faint like a medieval melodramatic toddler. You glance toward the corner of your room, where a wooden comb sits beside your belt. It's jagged, slightly scorched, and missing 2 teeth. Still, it does the job. You run it through your hair once, twice. A few flakes of dried soap fall to your lap. Progress. You wonder what it might have cost to visit a barber back then. A few coins, a piece of bread, a strong goat. Services were often bartered, especially in rural areas, and the value wasn't just the shave. It was the illusion of care, the feeling that someone else was managing the mess. You exhale slowly, because tonight, you're the barber, the surgeon, the saint, and the half-clean mortal left, sitting in a cooling room, combing your own hair, hoping that no one knocks on the door and smells your vinegar-soaked rag. You reach for it again, just a dab behind the ear. For old time's sake, your head tilts back slightly as the comb drags through the last few tangles. The fire gives a little sigh of its own, a crack pop settle kind of sound, and outside the shutters, the night wraps itself more tightly around the eaves. You set the comb down and consider the absurdity of it all. You've bathed, sort of. You've perfumed, arguably. You've played amateur barber without drawing blood. But there's still one corner of medieval hygiene you haven't tackled yet, and you're not ready for bed until you do. The toilet situation. A silence falls in your mind like a dropped chamber pot. You've avoided thinking about it all evening, focusing instead on baths and herbs and barbers. But now the truth can no longer be flushed away. At some point, you'll have to use the latrine, and it will be unpleasant. Because in the medieval world, toilets were a gamble at best, and a communal horror story at worst. You glance toward the back corner of your home, where a small wooden bench with a hole sits over a pit. You built it yourself. It's better than what many folks had, which was either a communal outhouse in the village or a designated poop corner near the pig enclosure. Some castles had stone seats built into the outer walls, allowing waste to fall directly down into the moat, which, incidentally, explains a lot about medieval moats. Historians still argue whether these garderobes, a charming term that sounds like a fancy closet but isn't, were actually used daily or saved for nobility, while everyone else went wherever. There's evidence of chamber pots tucked under beds, of ditches dug behind homes, and of night soil being collected to fertilize fields. Ah yes, your food's future ingredients. You rise reluctantly, wrap your now mostly dry cloth tighter, and shuffle across the floor. Your own toilet is modest but functional. There's moss stuffed into a pot beside it, your toilet paper for the evening. No rolls, no perfume wet wipes, just slightly crunchy green stuff pulled from a stone wall earlier this week. You stare into the hole, as if it might offer spiritual guidance. Nothing. You sit and immediately regret it, because the air down there is cold. The smell is complex, and the sense of dignity is non-existent. But you're not alone in this. Even medieval royalty had to deal with some version of the same discomfort. The French court employed groom de toilette, someone whose job was to help with bathroom duties. Henry VIII had an official groom of the stool, a man of high trust who helped the king wipe and recorded His Majesty's digestive patterns in a logbook. You blink and silently thank your ancestors for not being born that trusted. The deed is done. You use the moss with extreme skepticism, dab yourself into vague acceptability, and stand. You add a sprinkle of wood ash to the pit, trying to keep the smell down. It doesn't help, but it feels like it helps, which is often the best you can ask for. You return to your stool by the fire, a little lighter, a little humbler. You've survived the medieval toilet gauntlet. Barely. You rub your hands together, then frown. No sink, no soap. You glance at the corner where your vinegar rag sits, like an unimpressed ghost of sanitation past. You pick it up, dab your fingertips, wave them near the fire like you're performing some ancient hygienic ritual, which, honestly, you are, because back then, hand washing was less about germs, which no one understood yet, and more about appearance. You'd rinse before meals or after messier tasks. But unless someone was watching, you might skip it altogether, especially if water was scarce. Some folks kept scented water bowls near the entrance to their homes. Guests would dip their fingers in and wipe them on linen cloths. Others used ash, sand, or even flour to scrub their skin when water wasn't available. The goal wasn't sterilization, it was presentation. You hold your hands up now, backlit by firelight. They don't sparkle, but they also don't reek. Another medieval hygiene victory. You settle back into your stool, wrapping the dry cloth around yourself like a victory cloak. Across the room, the toilet bench sits in silence. Hopefully for the rest of the night. The fire offers a few last crackles of comfort, as if it too is winding down after witnessing everything you've just been through. But as the warmth soothes your fingers, your mind drifts again. If bathing, perfuming, and toilet use were all unpredictable exercises in discomfort, then what about laundry? You stare at your linen shift, now airing by the fire. It smells faintly of smoke and herb vinegar, a definite improvement from how it started. But the effort to get it clean in the first place, exhausting. 'Cause in medieval life, laundry day was never a small affair. You picture a wooden tub not for soaking you, but for beating the grime out of your clothes. The water would be boiled over a fire, a process that took hours, with smoke rising like a grim little cloud of future disappointment. Ash or lye was tossed into the mix, creating a caustic solution strong enough to strip the color off your favorite tunic and your skin if you weren't careful. Historians still argue whether lye washing was common among everyday folks or reserved for linen and ritual cloths. Some suggest that heavy-duty laundry was often communal, done by groups of women at rivers or public washhouses. Others point out that wealthier households employed full-time washerwomen professionals who knew the delicate line between scrub clean and chemically incinerated. You imagine standing by a frosty riverbank, smacking a shirt against a smooth stone, hands red from the cold. The sound echoes across the hills laundrish as percussion. You weren't just cleaning fabric. You were battling it, and you weren't doing it often. Most people wash their outer garments just a few times a year. That's not an exaggeration. Linen undergarments worn closest to the skin were washed more frequently, but even that depended on water availability, soap rations, and energy. Your best laundry plan was strategic sweating. You shift your shoulder, thinking about the shirt you're wearing. How many wears would it have gotten in the 1300s before someone said, maybe it's time? 10, 20, a winter's worth. People had tricks. They hung clothes near smoke to mask odors, brushed off dirt with dried herbs, dried garments in strong sun to bleach out suspicious colors. And when things got truly dire, they simply turned the garment inside out. You smile. The classic medieval reset button. It was, in its way, an art form. Cleanliness wasn't an expectation, it was a performance. You didn't need spotless robes. You just needed to look like someone who could afford a servant to deal with it. Even if that servant was you, of course. Your hypothetical 14th century self wouldn't have had multiple outfits. Maybe two, one for work, one for nice occasions, if by nice you mean not covered in manure. You reach over to poke your shift with one finger, still damp at the seams. You flip it once more, hoping the fire will finish the job, and then you remember something oddly sweet. A tiny detail buried in a dusty account of a medieval manor. How a washerwoman once tied bundles of rosemary and thyme to the inside of the drying room beams, so the scent would settle into the clothes as they hung. A little mercy in the middle of the struggle. You look up at the ceiling above your fire. No rosemary. Just soot, but maybe, in the scent of vinegar and the echo of old river songs, there's a faint trace of those ancient hands, scrubbing, soaking, squeezing, and never quite getting things perfectly clean. The fire has burned low now, leaving glowing coals and a gentle heat that strokes your ankles like a sleepy cat. Your shift, while still slightly damp, no longer drips. You've earned this moment of rest, or at least, you've clawed your way to it through vinegar, moss, moral panic, and the mild trauma of medieval lie. And now your thoughts drift to the people who didn't have firelight, or even a proper roof. Because while you've been navigating the domestic horrors of cleanliness, someone had to clean the public spaces. Enter the gong farmer. Yes, you heard that right. The title was real. These were the people tasked with emptying the cesspits, latrines, and privy chambers of medieval towns. And no, they weren't celebrated in songs or knighted for valor. But without them, everything would have collapsed under the literal weight of its own filth. You sit up straighter, suddenly grateful for your single-pit latrine. Gong farmers, also known as night soil men, worked mostly after dark, under cover of moonlight. They would climb down into the stink pits of the city, shovel in hand, and begin the slow, backbreaking task of scooping out waste that had accumulated in barrels, ditches, and privy vaults. The smell was unspeakable, the hazards constant, the wages surprisingly decent. Historians still argue whether gong farmers were truly reviled or quietly respected. On one hand, their work was crucial. On the other, their mere presence often made others gag. Some cities placed heavy restrictions on where they could live, when they could appear in public, and how long they could work before they had to ironically clean themselves. You picture one now, a man with a leather hood, his boots crusted with something you don't want to identify, his lantern swaying gently. He walks past your home, wheelbarrow squeaking, shovel dragging. You nod respectfully through your shutter. He nods back. Mutual understanding, because hygiene wasn't just a personal matter, it was a municipal battle. How the towns appointed scavengers to clear refuse from the streets. Laws were passed about where people could dump waste. Spoiler, not the river. People still did. Public fountains were guarded, sometimes even chained off, to prevent washing livestock or rinsing chamber pots in them. You shift again, feeling the fire's heat fading at your back. In wealthier areas, bathhouses were sometimes regulated, temperatures recorded, water replaced on schedule, even gender separated by city ordinance. But the further you got from the town center, the more hygiene returned to guesswork. And yet, things were improving. In the late Middle Ages, some cities built covered sewer channels, employed public bathhouse attendants, and even began to inspect bakeries and butcher shops for cleanliness. Incredibly progressive, if you ignore the part where they sometimes also inspected astrologers for planetary alignment. You imagine a town official leaning over a butcher's table, sniffing a week-old goose leg, then glancing skyward to see if Saturn was being difficult. Progress. You wrap your cloth tighter, the warmth now coming from within. Because what you've realized is that medieval hygiene wasn't a failure of understanding, it was a patchwork of effort, tradition, desperation, and the occasional stroke of genius, like the woman who hung herbs in her laundry rafters, or the monk who insisted vinegar baths cured melancholy, or the gong farmer, shoveling quietly beneath the stars, keeping everything from falling apart. You lift your mug in a sleepy toast to them all. Your mug lingers mid-air for a moment longer, a silent tribute to all the unsung heroes of medieval cleanliness. You take a final sip, the ale's flatness now oddly comforting, and set it down with a clink. Outside, the wind rustles a shutter. Inside, the warmth of the fire clings like old linen. And your thoughts wander again. Because if we've talked about bathers, barbers, and brave waste collectors, there's still one group who turned hygiene into something closer to ritual theater. The monastic bathers. Yes, monks. Those robe-wrapped, prayer-chanting, bell-ringing monks who, depending on the century and the order, were surprisingly devoted to washing. But not too often. Not luxuriously. Just methodically, you picture yourself in a cloister, stone walls, cloaked in ivy. A long corridor of cool air and quiet echo. Somewhere nearby, the low splash of water into a cistern. Monasteries were some of the few places in medieval Europe that consistently maintained bathing spaces, though they weren't always warm, or frequent, or optional. Most rules, like the Benedictine rule, only permitted a handful of baths per year, often just 3 or 4, but monks were also required to wash their hands before meals, their feet on specific holy days, and their linens more than you'd expect for people sworn to poverty. Historians still argue whether this meant monks were cleaner than average or simply better at pretending they were. Monastic records sometimes mention communal bathhouses within abbey walls, with protocols for who entered when. Privacy was rare. Modesty was enforced. Hot water. If you were lucky, soap. If you made it yourself, you close your eyes and imagine kneeling beside a copper basin, your feet in cool water, a silent brother beside you doing the same. The scent of lavender oil pressed in the garden drifts in. A single candle flickers against the stone. No conversation, just the soft sound of washing, and the creak of worn wood beneath your knees. There's something peaceful about it, less about removing dirt, more about removing noise. You think about your own bath tonight, the mess and the jokes and the vinegar rag, and you realize you've been doing your version of a monastic cleansing all along. Quiet, intentional, mostly unsupervised. Your fingers drift across your sleeve, still slightly damp from earlier. You pick at a loose thread and remember that some monasteries had laundry cycles built into their week: Monday for linens, Friday for robes, Wednesday for something else. Some even had full-time launderers and herb gardens cultivated not for cooking, but for washing: sage, thyme, marjoram, mint, the medieval laundry aisle. And it wasn't just for comfort. Cleanliness, however limited, was a spiritual offering, a way to show humility before God, and maybe avoid distracting the other monks with your foot funk during matins. You chuckle softly. Then you remember that even silence had its sound. Bathing together, in stillness, created a rhythm of its own, a kind of sacred ASMR. The splash of water, the scrape of pumice stone, the whisper of cloth on skin. The idea wasn't to feel good, but to feel right. That's what tonight has been, hasn't it? Not a spa day, a recalibration. You rise slowly and stretch, your joints creaking like the abbey floorboards you imagined. Somewhere in your bones, a monk is nodding in approval. You pat down your tunic, check the fire, and hum softly. Your monastery may be imaginary, but your peace is real. The warmth from the coals now hugs your shins like a heavy wool blanket, and your mind is beginning to drift, the way it does when sleep is near but not quite here. You shift just once and pull the cloth tighter around your shoulders. You think, was that it? Did I survive medieval cleanliness? Not quite, because you haven't yet faced your bed. And oh, what a situation your bed is. In the medieval world, a bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a weird ecosystem, a battleground, a social zone, a microbial experiment. You turn toward yours, a humble wooden frame with rope strung beneath a straw-stuffed mattress, softened only slightly by your nightly tossing. The straw's been replaced recently. 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. It's hard to tell. The stuff shifts and compresses, like sleeping on a lumpy loaf of peasant bread. Still, better than the floor. You press your palm into the mattress. It rustles like dry grass and disappointment. In wealthier homes, beds were elaborate. Carved oak frames, heavy curtains, layers of feather beds and quilts. But even those were crawling with things you don't want to meet. Fleece, leche, mites, the occasional wandering rat, depending on how generous the thatching was overhead. Historians still argue whether regular folk truly slept dirty, or if we underestimate how often they cleaned their bedding. Some say straw was changed every season. Others say it was rarely touched unless it caught fire or moved on its own. And changing the sheets might just mean flipping the linen and beating it with a stick. You imagine this ritual now, a stick in one hand, a cloud of ancient fluff rising like incense. You do your best to replicate it, patting down your own bedding, feeling for cold spots, rogue lumps, or anything that squirms. The linen cover smells faintly of rosemary ash, with undertones of shared sweat from 1403. You inhale. Not bad. Honestly, then you pull back the top layer and check for surprises. Nothing, unless you count the faint impression of last night's sleep position, which looks suspiciously like someone trying to escape a straw prison. You smile, and you remember a curious medieval belief. That night, fresh air was dangerous. People thought sleeping with windows open let illness drift in, so bedrooms stayed sealed, musty, full of shared air and body heat. It was hygienic logic turned backward. You, however, have cracked your shutter slightly, just enough to let in a hint of cool night breeze. Risky, maybe, but a small rebellion in the name of breathable air. Before climbing in, you pause to consider your sleepwear, which is optional. In medieval times, people didn't always have a separate nightgown. Many just slept in their shift or nude, depending on the weather and their tolerance for itchy straw. Beds were communal too. You might share it with a sibling, a child, a spouse, or three, and heaven help you if none of you bathed. You, thankfully, are sleeping solo tonight. You ease into the mattress. Straw crunches softly beneath you. It's lumpy. It's slightly uneven. It's perfect. Your body settles into the contours you've worn into it, like a nest built out of centuries of bad posture. And now, at last, you are still. You've washed without drowning. You've perfumed without passing out. You've cleaned your hands, your linens, your soul, or close enough. And now, wrapped in vinegar, soot, and the faint pride of having scrubbed your ears with a twig, you close your eyes. Tomorrow will be equally gross, but tonight you are clean enough for dreams. You shift once more, slowly, your limbs easing into the reluctant comfort of your straw bed. The fire's final breath dances along the coals with a soft hiss, its glow pulsing low and steady, like the heartbeat of a world that's finally beginning to forgive you for scrubbing your armpits with dried thyme and rainwater vinegar. But before sleep can claim you fully, there's one last layer of medieval hygiene lore to peel back. What did people do when they couldn't clean themselves at all? You blink slowly in the dark, because not everyone had access to vinegar, bathhouses, or even the occasional moss wipe. Plagues happened, wars rolled in, villages were burned, rivers poisoned, wells fouled. Sometimes clean wasn't just a luxury, it was a fantasy. So what did they do? They improvised. You pull the edge of your linen shift closer, your thoughts drifting to the battlefield tent of a wounded soldier, or the cramped hideaway of a woman fleeing political unrest, or the monk, sick with fever, confined to a stone cell, unable to stand. And in each case, they kept trying. They scraped dirt off with wooden spoons. They rubbed ash into their skin to absorb oils. They braided long hair to hide the worst of the knots. They dusted themselves with dried herbs and said quiet prayers that whatever was making their skin burn wasn't contagious. You remember the tale of Queen Elizabeth Thorpast far from the medieval period. Yes, but still steeped in that pre-plumbing anxiety, who reportedly bathed only a handful of times per year and powdered herself heavily to hide blemishes. The body was a battlefield of appearances. Historians still argue whether people believed in the miasma theory out of sincere belief or sheer desperation. The idea that sickness came from bad smells gave a sense of control. If you could just avoid the scent, maybe the sickness would avoid you. So people clutched sweet posies, wore waxed masks stuffed with spices, and refused to walk through alleys that reeked, not because they were clean, but because they were trying. You glance toward the corner of your room again, where your vinegar rag now lies like a flag of survival. You tried to, and you're still here. You remember something else. How many cultures viewed bathing not as hygiene, but as vulnerability, a moment when your guard was down, your body exposed, your scent removed. To be clean was to be open, and in times of war, famine, or plague, that was a risk few were willing to take. So they layered clothing, not for warmth, but for barrier. They coated themselves in wool and leather and linen, turning sweat into a shield. They believed that what couldn't touch the skin couldn't infect the soul. Of course, it didn't really work. But the effort, the stubborn, fumbling effort, that was the magic. You shift again. The straw welcomes you with its usual crinkle, and you think, perhaps for the first time, that medieval hygiene wasn't gross. It was brave, a daily dance with water and fire and social rules, a negotiation between nature and superstition, a quiet kind of hope scrubbing one's hands in icy stream water while whispering, "Please let this be enough." And tonight, for you, it was, you rest your head against the cloth-wrapped bundle that passes for a pillow, and let your breath slow. The world may still be smoky, itchy, and half clean, but you're a little less filthy and a lot more human. The hush has deepened now. Even the fire has surrendered, leaving only red glow ghosts in the ashes. Your fingers curl loosely at your sides, and your breath begins to match the still rhythm of the night. You've earned this rest, as much as anyone who survived medieval hygiene could. But there's one final truth to settle in your bones before the dark folds you in completely. Being clean has never meant the same thing across time. You think about that now, nestled in your straw cradle, the scent of vinegar and dried herbs lingering like faint, homemade incense. In the modern world, you can summon hot water with a twist. Lather foams in luxurious towers. Fabric softener promises clouds. Shower pressure is a personal preference. But back then, cleanliness was a compromise. And sometimes, it was a statement. Think of the nobleman whose powdered wig covered a scalp that hadn't been washed in weeks. Or the nun who used snow to bathe because water froze solid by dawn. Or the child sent to fetch moss, not to play, but to keep the household supplied with natural wipes. Historians still argue whether ancient Roman baths spoiled Europe for centuries, leaving expectations too high to meet again for 1,000 years. They debate whether medieval folk were genuinely indifferent to cleanliness, or just adapting to the limits of their world. You lie still now, and in your stillness, you see them, a peasant girl washing her feet in secret before a festival dance, a monk plucking rosemary to mask the mildew in the laundry hall, a housewife boiling linens in a copper cauldron, humming to herself despite the stench, and yes, even a nervous servant dabbing perfume behind their ears, hoping the Lord won't notice the week-old tunic. It wasn't laziness, it was effort wrapped in limitation, just like yours, and so, your body wrapped in linen, layered in modest smells and hard-earned dryness, begins to surrender to rest. You've walked through grime and soot and soapless scrubbing. You've crouched over pits, peeked into monkish baths, and beaten laundry into reluctant obedience. You've survived history's scratchiest, smelliest, most vinegar-splashed bedtime. And now, finally, we begin to let go. The room is weightless now. Every breath stretches longer. Every sound softens. Your limbs feel distant, like old laundry hung out to dry beneath a gentle sky. No rush, no urgency, just a slow drift downward. The crackle of the fire has faded to a soft memory. Your hands rest quietly on your chest. One finger twitches, not from effort, but from the last echo of motion, winding down like a toy left spinning just a little too long. Outside, the wind hushes. The shutter creaks one last time, then stills. Your body feels warm in some places, cool in others. The shift of fabric against skin, the soft, uneven give of straw beneath your weight. A crinkle, a sigh. You don't need to move, not now. Your breath drifts slower, and slower still. You're wrapped in echoes of lavender, vinegar, smoke. You are clean enough for sleep, clean enough for dreams, clean enough for nothing at all. Let it all fall away. Let the moss and the vinegar and the scratchy wool slip into the dark. You've survived the stink and the steam and the superstition. And now, it's just you, soft air, silent coals, and the gentle pull of sleep, folding around you like a fresh dried sheet. That's it. Let go. You're safe. You're still. You're drifting. Good night.